Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I have another special guest with me today, Ishan Dubey. Do you want to introduce yourself, Ishan?
Hi, my name is Ishan. I competed at Strake for 4 years and now coach there. Most recently, we won the TOC, and we also won it last year. So, developing a kind of history of success with Strake, which
Yeah,
has been great to be part of.
speaking of a history of success, I would say you have a bit of a personal history of success as well, getting 36 bids, 27 of which were gold bids. Also, getting to finals of TOC in 2022 yourself. And sort of as revenge, it seems like you've come back and coached some kids to win that finals round a few times. In addition to like breaking three teams at the TOC both this year and last year, and qualifying eight teams to the TOC this year, which are some impressive numbers. So you have a lot to be proud of, and I'm excited to have you here on the channel to spread some of your wisdom.
All right, thank you.
Okay, the first thing that we'll get into then is you've clearly been a very prolific coach. So I want to pick your brain about some coaching advice. Um, First, you sent me a message recently about how you believe that there are some things that camps can do better. I also noticed that you are going to be coaching at one of said camps at ISD this summer. Shout out. So my question is a bit of a two-part question. What are your complaints with camps as they are right now? And also, what do you think can be done? What do you think you will do to fix some of these problems?
So I think I have some like organizational complaints with camps, but I'll stick to what I think is like more manageable, which is just like the teaching side of things. Think part of it is that a lot of people aren't given a lot of direction on what to teach, and so a lot of people are kind of shooting very like blindly when it comes to designing a lecture or drills. And there's a lot of time in the day, and a lot of that time I think is not used very efficiently. I think part of this is that a lot of camp schedules just aren't designed very well. So like for example, the camp I worked at, NSD, which I think like had the most people attended, which is a great benefit. Like there was an early morning lab, which was like an hour, and it was the first thing that we did every morning. Like that almost always got like very little, if anything, done because people are walking in late, people are waking up. And then they had like, an optional seminar section afterward. And so really the only time of the day where you had to do something is like these 4 hours. So I think a lot of the time is just time that could be used more efficiently, whether that be like actually debating rounds, or actually talking about something materially that would kind of, make people better. I think another thing that is kind of hard to deal with, this is like maybe true for bigger camps, is maintaining like kind of a staff student ratio that makes sense. So most camps try to keep it around 1 to 5. 1 to 5 feels okay, but I wish it would get closer to 1 to 4 just so that you can actually have one judge per round. So at like, NSD, for example, where I worked, um, there would be one round kind of built in every day mostly. But the problem is when you have one person for every five like people, you don't get everyone to judge a debate. And so like people were going without debates on any given day. And I think that is also kind of a problem. I think there's a lot of downtime that could be used more effectively. And I think like maybe when it comes to some people that are giving lectures, you're not always getting the most ideal person for the lecture. Like I'll say this because he's a teammate of mine, but someone was giving like a prepping to win lecture. And he was like, dude, like I cut one card my senior year. And I was like, okay, well, I'm sure you still have insightful stuff to say, but like it's how it is. And I think like this is mostly a problem with size than it is with anything, which is especially true in PF because it's such a big and growing event. And so managing that size seems really difficult. I think part of the reason I chose to work with ISD is that like the people I've spoken with that have worked there have expressed like a great interest in kind of molding the camp to be better. And also I think it is at that point where it hasn't gotten so big as to like, maybe limit some of their possibilities. And so I think from a staff perspective as well, they have an excellent staff. And so like the quality of instruction you will receive is high. I think there's a good amount of direction from like senior instructors and people that have been doing debate for a really long time, which is also helpful. Obviously, like that itself does not replace and solve some of the problems I have with the way camp is run. in many instances, or what people are actually learning from the camp. I think like part of this is that a lot of camps, right, are just like too willing to teach students what they want to learn. And so like if you go to camp, people are always going to be like, I want to learn K debate, I want to learn theory debate. Like I saw this really cool round with like this philosophical argument. I want to know everything about it. Which while you like, while that desire is good, that doesn't necessarily mean like that's the number one thing you should be learning. And then a lot of people, especially when they are newer to teaching, will be like, okay, that's what you want to learn, let's do it. But that might not be the most effective thing for them to learn in that given moment. And so I think part of it is that as well. Especially with like how many different arguments there are in PF and styles. Like you get someone that's debated in one part of the country. This is less so a problem now, but especially I remember like my freshman and sophomore year, like the differences in styles between geographic regions was just massive. So like a Northeast debater debated totally different from like someone from Texas. And so like you're getting different pieces of information from different people, and it becomes kind of a problem if you're not like getting the right amount of information or you're only seeking out one perspective. And so I think forcing students to maybe do things they don't immediately want, but that you know will be good for them is also something that I think camps don't do enough of.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that ironically, I mean, I don't want this video to be like just an ad for ISD, but I think ISD actually does this very well. They've got like a bit of a different structure than some of the other camps that I've worked in. I also worked at ISD for a few sessions, and they like rotate the junior instructors across different labs. So the senior instructors run each lab, and then the junior instructors sort of like bob back and forth between a few of them, and also do things like run practice rounds and run office hours, etc. The one thing that I really liked about ISD though is that I feel like it's more like a camp vibe. Some of these other camps, they feel like, I don't know, they're a little bit hardcore, you know, like it's very much like go, go, go all the time. And especially when some of that time, to your point, is also feels a little bit wasted. I feel like it encourages a lot more burnout. Like, I'm not going to name names, but there are some camps that I attended that were not ISD where like I probably objectively got better, but I like didn't want to do debate as much after going to the camp. I feel like one of the most important things about going to camp is meeting people around you and engendering sort of a love of debate and a passion for debate as well that keeps you going instead of just giving you homework assignments like the entire time.
Yeah,
But
yeah, absolutely.
I think that
Yeah, I
my
think one thing that I totally relate to about that is that like I found like the most like stimulating part of camp was just like leaving labs or like with like questions and thoughts and ideas and wanting to experiment and doing that kind of thing. I do think though like the biggest benefit to camp is not actually the usually the curriculum. It's just being around people like like-minded people who are interested in debate and want to get better. And like obviously with similar levels of experience, you can share ideas, thoughts, strategies, that sort of thing. And so like, you know, that I think is the biggest benefit. So I think a lot of camps, like when they do say people go to the camp and be successful, that is true. But I also think that like they could attend, if you put that group of kids at almost any camp in the country, they would have been similarly successful. So like I think that like results from camps can be misleading. Now I think some camps like absolutely have the right to claim, you know, success for the way their students teach. And like, for example, some camps are designed to facilitate interaction. Like again, NSC, the camp I worked at years prior, does a great job of facilitating people just interacting with each other, which is tremendously helpful. But I do think the biggest benefit of camp is actually just with what you make of it with the people you surround yourself with and just being thinking about debate, regardless of the actual details of the instruction.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting sort of like market if you think about it. Like I remember during COVID, all these random camps popping up and lots of established ones sort of like withering away and wondering why. And it seems like one of the big reason for that is because the market is driven mostly by like the students and not the instructors, if that makes sense. Like I feel like if all of the students agree that like all of the best students agree to go to one camp, then like that camp suddenly immensely rises in value just because those students will be there and you'll like have other people who are at high levels of debate to talk with and so to some extent like yeah I would say most of the value of camp is definitely just the other students you'll be with there. Let's move.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Did you have anything to say about that?
I guess the one thing I'll say is that I think part of the reason, just like maybe like to try to explain some of that shift, is that like PF is just changing so dramatically. In policy and LD, there's kind of a tried and true way to maybe teach the event. Less so LD, but definitely policy. Although those events definitely experience their own forms of innovation and stylistic changes, that is just so dramatic in PF. So like the kinds of things you would teach at a camp 2 years ago, entirely different from the kinds of things you would teach at a camp this year. And so like camps that can keep up with that, and still teach what they want to do and teach effective. And that's kind of maybe why those newer camps and those COVID camps actually had some success and retain students. But yeah, just like rapid developments in the circuit do, I think, influence where people go to camp.
Yeah, actually, speaking of rapid developments, I mean, I guess that's what like all of the rest of this call will be. But there's one thing that I think remains regardless of how rapid the development of the activity is. And that's something that you are calling like in-round presence, I guess. Can you say a little bit about that in the context of like what you teach your students?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll kind of talk about what it is, and then like why it's important, and then sort of how to teach it. I'm still kind of figuring out the third part. But I think in-round presence is like kind of similar to situational awareness. In any given debate, like you can only do so much prep for it. Like it is impossible to perfectly script out a round, like leading up to every word. Like you can get most of it down, I guess. But there is a requirement that for you to win, you need to be able to navigate new situations and novel circumstances. So that's part of it. I think another part of it is recognizing that you are debating in front of people. And I think this is the hardest thing for people to realize. I think especially after the online era, where like you had a lot of like Discord rounds or like Zoom rounds or whatever. You're less used to debating in front of people, and people that are flowing the debate actively, people that are watching the debate. And that creates its unique set of pressures and circumstances. Like for example, if you know someone is reading a particular type of argument, the way you engage that argument is tremendously important. The stylistic preferences of your judges also play into this. Now, some people might think this only applies to like lay and flay judges. I actually think it's the opposite. I think tech judges are less revealing about their biases and unique preferences because they want to seem more technical. And while their paradigms might suggest like a particular leaning on a certain issue, like that's usually not comprehensive. And there are certain like knee-jerk reactions that any judge will have to an argument. There are certain pressures. Like for example, if you are reading something like set call and your other team's response is like screw you, like okay, whatever, like we might but extinction outweighs. And you phrase that poorly, like in a paneled elimination round, that is a hard sell. Like judges have desires for teams they want to vote for based on the arguments being read, and how debaters are arguing those arguments, even if it doesn't directly impact, for example, their evaluation of the flow. It might impact, like, for example, what they flow, or what they choose to resolve certain clash with. And so that requires, I think, a lot of experience. And for you to recognize that you were debating in front of one or three people, usually, sometimes more, definitely like if round robins, there are two judges. So instead of just debating to win, you need to debate to win the judge. And I think that's what in-round presence is kind of about. It's about recognizing like, what do I need to do in this particular situation? Is there something based on a development in this round that I think can alter the trajectory of the round? This is another thing, right? People are not willing to sometimes let go of their strategy before the round if one team just hands them a free win. Like if they, do something incredibly silly, make an incredibly silly argument, read a like straight out double turn. And you're like, I don't feel confident in this because I'm so like, reliant on my prep. And so like, I think that's kind of what in-round presence is about. It's about being focused on the round itself, kind of determining what you need to do, not only based on your like pre-round strategy, but also on the developments of the round, and then paying attention to the judges being people. Um, its importance, I think I've kind of stressed a little bit throughout this explanation of what it is, but especially in elimination round debates. I think like this is maybe less so a thing in prelims, like you can afford a loss here and there, and it's still only one judge, but especially in elimination round debates, like most of my students who lose split decision rounds, those are totally rounds where if you adjusted like a few minor things, they could win. And a lot of that is just like it could be panel adaptation, it could be just the way you articulate something in any given round, based on like, for example, the experience the judge has or whatever it may be. So yeah, I think that's why it's important. I guess how would I teach it or how do you teach it? That's the hardest part. Because like when you're coaching or teaching debate, like you lose control of the round as soon as the round starts. And then people have like a natural tendency to revert back to what's comfortable in a debate round. It's very hard for them to like take risks. Or like sometimes they will just go with what they know. And so like I think one thing that I do teach is like, for example, reading paradigms or explaining to someone how someone, for example, might interpret a statement differently based on how you phrase it. I think a good mindset to put yourself in is just put yourself in the judge's shoes. Obviously, this is something that people have said a lot, but seriously think about how would like a neutral third party try to evaluate this round. And I think one of the best ways to maybe do this is always think of like if my opponents were to win, what would be the way? Like what is the rationalizable ballot for the other team? And if you can come up with that rationalizable ballot, like if you the more you get it, you will get it down. In fact, if you lose, you will be like, okay, maybe I don't agree with what the judge decided, but I understand, like maybe I don't think it's reasonable, but I understand why that was a rationalizable decision. And the more you come up with that, based on, for example, a judge's paradigm or the way you acted in a round, or maybe that you were unclear at a particular moment, and less about just like, oh, like I didn't extend like the fourth, like, internal link or something like that, unless that's particularly relevant in a given round. I think the better you will become at recognizing the kind of intuitive reactions that you need to have to certain situations.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like certainly the hardest part of this is teaching it. I think that what you're talking about with looking from the perspective of the judge, and most importantly, like thinking about what that rationalizable ballot against you looks like, hopefully before it is cast against you. That's like huge. One thing is like I think students should just actually judge more. Both fictionally, like I guess go on PF videos and pretend to judge around, and also in reality as much as possible. Like I don't know if you have practice rounds, go judge those, or if you I don't know doing like there are probably other opportunities to like judge a middle school round or something. But putting yourself in that mindset is like one of the most important things to do. But I think this whole business about in-round presence is so important, and I think literally like this might be 90% of what separates a good debater from a great debater. Like there are so many debaters that I know who are so competent on the flow. And I'm just thinking like if I replaced you with this other debater I know, making the exact same arguments, but just changing the wording, like they would win 10 times more than you. And there's no technical reason why. The technical reason it's just like I maybe they like package the argument slightly differently, and so maybe that changes the implications. But really, that's kind of nonsense. Like the only actual reason why this is happening is because of things like ballot directive language and the ability to have like that presence in the round in front of the judge. There's two things I want to say about this before we move on. One is there's a really good analogy I came up with for how you can understand this, which is like if you imagine that your opponents are like on a TV and they're giving speeches that are like completely scripted, and you are in the room with the person judging you, and you're just giving your speeches to that person. Like it's obvious, I think, who will have an advantage in that round. You will literally just be talking to the person about why the people on the TV are wrong. And they will technically be reacting to you, but they're reacting like they're robots. They're reacting by like reading another speech and you know what they're going to say. But it's so much more persuasive to actually be talking to the judge themselves and actually like try to get into their head and have a conversation with them instead of just like reading your script and only reacting to what the opponents are doing. The second thing that I want to say, and this is a very important point that took me a long time to understand, is the reason this is true for tech judges is because there is no objective ideal way to judge. There is always a way that I can justify in my technical non-interventionist paradigm a ballot for each team. And that's true of 100% of rounds. The reason why is because there's a lot of sort of inherently fuzzy things in technical debate that you can use to pull the trigger for one team or another arbitrarily. Extensions is an example. Like, did you extend enough of your case? If I don't like you, I can just say, well, yeah, I didn't hear a warrant in summary. GG, that's no offense. And that's like the easiest thing possible I can do to just drop you technically. Or I just like slightly change my criteria for what is sufficient or how I understand the implication of one of your arguments. Is it terminal? Is it mitigatory? Does you saying it's terminal make it terminal? Well, maybe it depends on how I feel that day. But there is no objective truth because like all of this is just norms all the way down. Like if you really break it down, there's no technically objective way to understand all of the language in the round. There's no technically complete way to understand the context of every single argument that you're making. And there's certainly no line that we can draw that is non-arbitrary for what counts as enough to prove an argument is true. And so because of all of those things, I think that it's 100% possible for any judge with any paradigm to change who they're voting for just based on vibes without even necessarily being conscious of it, which means you have to control the vibes even more in a tech round, perhaps.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I definitely think that there's like, I mean, some RFDs will be better than others, but there is, I think, a way in most situations to rationalize a ballot or justify a ballot based on, something in your paradigm or something technical or like a kind of non-interventionist philosophy. I think your first like kind of analogy is actually quite good. And I think that like a reason why is that like part of the thing with like a person being on the TV and another being in the room is that when someone's in the room with you, there maybe is a little bit of a pressure to not disagree with them. And I think this applies when you are judging as well. When people are saying the things you want to hear, when they're saying the kinds of arguments that you believe, when they are debating in a way that you think is a lot better than your opponents, even if you think they are technically like losing, like this is a person you do not necessarily want to upset. And so like judges also do the same thing. Like there are teams, there are styles of debate, maybe not teams, but styles of debate that they do not want to like sort of upset. And so like there is like a level of like the more comfort you get with the judge, the more personable you are in a kind of way. There's also an element of like judge pressure that gets involved. And I think this is true in paneled rounds. Where like, especially newer judges, like if you are judging, let's say you were a debater that like had some success, but it's your first time judging like a late elimination round and there's like a whole bunch of people watching, like you want to make a good decision, right? You don't want to look bad when you're making your decision. And then there are all kinds of pressures that come into play, which like people don't necessarily acknowledge or talk about, but that are definitely there.
Yeah, it's so true. I feel like half of writing like the perfect final focus is trying to take pressure off of the judge in voting for you. Like you want to make it more appealing to vote for you than vote for the opponent, obviously. But it's worth being said because there are so many judges, even the most technical judges, who write their RFD largely out of a calculus that is sort of selfish of which decision they think will get them less backlash, or which decision they think they can defend more against someone post-rounding them, for example. They want to maintain a reputation as being like a good technical judge. And so if you take the pressure off of them, for example, there's a big difference between just sending a really sketchy argument and then going for the sketchy argument and being like, listen, I know you don't want to vote for this. This is a stupid argument. Get real with them. And they should have made all these responses. There's like three responses that would have been easy takeouts. They just weren't in the round. And so this is a mistake they made. When you give the RFT, you should just tell them this is a terrible argument. It's really easy to respond to. And here's how you respond to it so that they can learn how to respond to it next time. You're not rewarding me the ballot because this is a great argument. You're punishing them for not responding to it correctly. And even just changing this narrative in a technical round, like it eases the pressure so much and it makes the judges realize that like yeah they can just blame you, they can just blame the mistakes that happened in the round. It's not that I'm advocating for this kind of tricky argument. It's that based on the structure of the PF round that happened before me, I'm compelled to vote for it even though I don't want to. And that I think is a major factor in causing judges to change their decisions even last minute in the round.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think like that last part is really important. Like sometimes like when I'm having people give redos, like the actual content of the speech won't change very much. Like the arguments they're going for, it'll be the exact same. It'll be like phrasing the arguments in a different way. It'll be maybe ordering them in a different way. And I think those difference like they occur maybe on the margins, but they're really important. Like the way you articulate, maybe like if you want to go for a time frame argument, the way you articulate that as like like if you but like I think one thing that like sometimes some of our debaters say is that like if you believe you will be alive tomorrow or something like that, like or some something where you kind of like stress the importance of your argument in a way that seems like it would actually matter to the judge
Yeah.
like as they are evaluating the round. Or like I actually really like the thing you were talking about, which is like I know there are like three really good responses they could have made. You maybe don't like list all of them out directly, right? But like exactly what you were talking about, where you could have been like, they could have said this, but they didn't. They said this and only this. And then you clarify like not only the argument they made, but also there is a gap between a better version of that argument that might actually be trouble for us and the actual argument they made, and you care about the actual argument they made. And so like it stops judges from making inferences when you do that. And so like definitely some acknowledgement of your situation or the quality of your opponent's responses. Like if your response to your opponent is turning on their argument not being developed instead of not being like an intuitive or true argument, that's sometimes a harder sell. Because like there is like an inclination to just do the development for them and be like, okay, well, this argument was really good. Like, I just don't think it was explained like the best, but I'm going to do it in my RFD anyway. Like you can stop judges from that impulse if you know, explain the gap between what like the perfect or like not necessarily perfect, but a well explained version of that argument is, what is how it is actually explained, why that gap is relevant. Yeah, so I think definitely some of that acknowledgement stuff is super, super good too.
Definitely. I didn't mean to spend this much time on this, but I have one more point on in-round presence because I really think this is like so important, which is there's a little secret sauce that is like balancing straw manning with steel manning. I think is a lot of what this boils down to. At least that's a very good tool that you can use to get better in-round presence. So straw manning is like their argument is literally that like nuclear energy is going to inspire terrorists from ISIS to come and like you know, radicalize some farmers in West Virginia to go block a nuclear plant. That's like obviously ridiculous. Whereas steel manning is being like, look, even if all of the things that we said today are wrong and they're right about everything, and they're even 10 times more important than even they said they were, and you can give them extra examples, even then they don't win. Balancing those two in terms of technical ethos, I think goes a very long way in creating this in-round presence. I think that the best debaters are very good at doing both of those things. Like you see this even in like TOC finals, for example. I've been rewatching this round a bunch, but like Grand Cross, for example, like Daniel and Jason are like, nah, this round is over, bro. Like you dropped that there's a link into warming and that you can't come back from that. Like, what are you doing? And that's like a clear example of the more straw manny, like on the spectrum, not straw manning as in like a bad thing, but like being very upfront about how extreme an argument is and making it maybe a little bit more extreme than it actually is in reality. But balancing that with like a bunch of even if claims, like even if we give them the most charitable case, you get the best version of the round because you're able to control for the maximum range of different perspectives that the judge might have. And there's an interesting like hack that is involved in this because even if technically you should lose on all of the available perspectives, putting them all up next to each other decreases the threshold for voting on one that they might not have otherwise voted on. Like if the judge is able to say in their RFD, well, I didn't vote for them on this or this or this or this, but I eventually had to vote on this fifth thing, that's often easier for them than just having only one. And obviously, this is a little bit controversial. Well, I'm not saying you shouldn't collapse. That's like the wrong interpretation of this. I'm saying that when you collapse, you need to collapse in a layered way. Like our collapse on this one argument wins the round because of this. But even if you don't believe this collapse wins because of this, because it's like it just obviously blows them out of the water, even if you think they still have something left, our collapse still beats that. It still overcomes what they have. And then going through those layers of charity allows the judge more leeway to vote how they might want to, even if it's not as technically sound. A little
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Okay, next question I have for you, related, I guess, to all of this coaching stuff. How did you prep for the TOC? You've coached two champions now, and you also, you know, prepped for your personal success at the TOC. What went into all of that, and what did you like do differently over time as well, having been in the activity for so long? What's the new strategy in 2025?
Yeah, I think actually it's become less and less like actual just bulk work. And it's become more either like skills development. This is less so the case with Jason and Daniel, because they were like doing college stuff and whatnot. But there was another team we had that I worked a lot with in terms of like skills development. And then also like I think recognizing that at the TOC, you need a certain you want strategies going in that you think can win no matter what your opponents say. Um, like I think a good way to think about it is you should be highly critical of your arguments. Like if there is a response that you don't think you can beat, like bad argument, leave it out. But also like there should be a level of being willing to take risks. I think like at the TOC both this year and last year, like all the teams I coached were willing to take risks to some extent in the debates they had. And so it was like maybe experimenting with those risks beforehand. But a lot of it is actually just getting a good amount of prep ideas so that when you get to the tournament, when there's like, that added motivation and like, you feel like you want to do more, that work is directed more effectively. I think like prep before the TOC, very important. Like get your arguments down, especially if it's one that you think might need some practice. But it was like not extraordinary, like the amount of work that was done before. And like the prep was like good or whatever, but it wasn't like I think like so I think I would compare this to like good prep is kind of like having a quarterback on a football team. And so like maybe like a fantasy quarterback is a better way to put it. And like, I'll explain this analogy a little bit. So like if you have like a Patrick Mahomes or like the best quarterback, like that's good. That's very good. And that might win you some weeks. But like 90%, maybe not 90%, but a majority of quarterbacks, a majority of cases don't make that much of a difference on the margins. It's about like execution strategy, the things surrounding that central player in this case which are particularly relevant. And so a lot of the prep for TOC was thinking about like, okay, like what are we gonna do once we get there? Like, how are we gonna spend time in between rounds? Like, how are we gonna do prep outs? What are the kinds of arguments we know we can read in a situation where we don't necessarily have the debate that we want to have? And a lot of that was involved as well. Like one of the teams that like they read like a K pretty much all of King, and they were like AF every single round. And the reason is because people were like mostly just flipping neg so that they could not be neg. And so like, obviously that is not something that they wanted to do. They wanted to read their K. But reading it neg first is interesting for reasons perhaps we'll discuss later. So they were forced to, talk about nuclear energy and investment in it, which is like kind of ironically not like the round they lost, but
Yeah.
like yeah, so preparing for those situations, having your bases covered, and then having some strategies that you think are interesting, valuable, and useful. I do think though, with the same actual like quantity of prep, and sometimes even quality, a lot of teams can have various different levels of success at the very same tournament, just either based on your familiarity with the prep. Or just like your execution with it. I think familiarity is something that I like was thinking about earlier, but didn't exactly cover. So I want to touch on that a little bit. I think familiarity is super, super important. Like one thing that I always ask people to do is like you should know what the purpose of every line or word in your case is. Sometimes that purpose is not good. Sometimes, or not necessarily not good, but not immediately like useful. Like it might just be rhetorical, but that still serves a purpose. Like it maybe like it sounds nice, and that's okay. Like if your answer is it sounds nice, sure, but you should know why this line is highlighted, why these set of words are highlighted this way as opposed to this way. What is the way you could use it later in the round? If you know the answer to how is every word of my case useful, you will be infinitely more successful than someone who just has the case. This also applies to blocks. And now it's harder to do with blocks, and I wouldn't recommend maybe that someone reads like every word of their block file and be like, yeah, this is the purpose of that. But I do think there is a like there should be an element of you reading the block file and being like, this is how I would respond to this argument. This is how I would extend and re-explain this argument. So actually, like before the TOC my junior year, like the person I partnered with for that year, because it was weird online year and you only needed one bid to qualify, was someone that we decided to go with like very last minute. So it was like a last day kind of thing. And like the entire night was pretty much spent just being like, okay, here's an argument in the block file, explain it back to me. And then are we on the same page? Does this explanation make sense? Do we understand the argument? And simply asking someone like, do you understand it? Not good. You should ask them to maybe re-explain the argument, or like explain its implications. What could it be useful in responding to? I think something you notice is that a lot of blocks in one section can be transferable to another argument, or that some blocks are just vastly better than others. Some are vastly over highlighted. Some are under highlighted. Some pieces of evidence are just really, really, really good and you don't know it. Some pieces of evidence are really, really, really bad and you just don't know it. So there is an element of like quality checking that, but familiarity and knowing the strategy is far more important. That's kind of what most of the time was spent doing.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And to echo this, I think that like one of the things that I teach my students is the blocks against the most stock arguments, I think often should be smaller than your not necessarily the blocks, but like your in-round rebuttals, like the amount of responses. I think you should be reading like 10 analytics against a surprise argument and three just like incredibly dense, incredibly good carded responses against the most common argument on the topic. And that I think the reason for that is because if you have enough time to prep against these very stock arguments, you should be cutting all of the stuff that doesn't matter. You should be breaking it down to just the most important core components of the blocks that you're going to have against the argument and the ones that all have a purpose that you could use later in the debate. That doesn't necessarily mean less content. Like maybe there are actually 10 pieces of these three responses. But you have that ability before the tournament to like make it hyper efficient and use that to not just increase the density of words, but the density of content, like the density of purpose that exists in there. So both for cases and block files, I think this is huge. Okay, another question about TOC that's been on my mind since I've already brought up finals, but I want to talk about it. First question for you. Obviously you watched the round. What is your RFD in the round?
So I'm not gonna like put aside bias because obviously there is like an element of some, but I actually do really like Armand and Anuj, and I voted for them, I think, almost every time I've judged them. But like I think I would have voted neg on the politics argument. I think that I actually think like the like Plano final like was really, really good, and I think they were doing a lot of the right things. But I thought that like maybe Strake was winning a link on politics. Maybe the defense explanation and final focus is a bit too new and too developed. And then from there, like probably weighing in Turn's case is good enough. I think that like Strake did kind of get a little bit ahead on the probability time frame debate that Plano started a little earlier in the round. Like I think there was some development, and then Plano left it behind for a little bit, and then tried to revisit it maybe a little too late. Without like going into too much detail because I can't remember like all the exact arguments, but that's kind of the general like feeling I got. And so probably somewhere there is how I would have voted. But I do have a lot of thoughts about the round. Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts as well. For what it's worth, I think I would have the exact same RFD. I think Turn's case is probably the easiest place to pull trigger for the neg, as long as you don't evaluate the defense as terminal, which I feel like this is somewhat paradigmatic.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but as long
Absolutely.
as you don't evaluate the defense as terminal, then I think probably the easiest thing is just to say time frame obviously matters more if it has a short circuit like appended to it. Because
Yeah.
then probability doesn't even like this links into probability weighing, I guess is the technical way to describe it. Like your probability is zero if we win that there's a very high probability of a short circuit against your argument. Or at the very least, this means that your probability is not in fact high, which jeopardizes the claims made about why probability is higher in the first place, even if we don't evaluate the whole like does probability matter, is it subjective kind of stuff, which I do think we missed a little bit, but I think there are ways of coming back from it. Speaking of ways of coming back from it, this is an interesting question, I think. What do you think is the path to the ballot for Plano? If you had to give the final focus with infinite knowledge of what the judges' RFDs actually ended up being, what would you have done differently? Do you think there's a way to only change final focus to win them the round?
Maybe, and I think it would not be on technical terms though. It would be on some sort of like, judge preference sort of thing. I do think the final focus is really good. And I think that like it was doing a lot of the same things I was thinking about, like what is the best version of the speech? And a lot of the things I was thinking of like in the moment were things that were actually done. I think maybe there is a risk in going for the defense that hard because a lot of judges just decided to draw the line and be like, too new. So maybe there is some worth spending time there. Like it is valuable to spend time there, or maybe you do some more ballot direction there and be like, this explanation may sound new, and just explicitly acknowledge that, get that out the way because it does sound new, and then be like, here's why it's justified. Like this is what they said in summary, and I will hold them to that. Remember, like you should not have any more than this on your flow. And I think there actually might be a reasonable way to articulate the defense there. I think maybe on the weighing debate, there is something to be had with more time there. I think it's very clear that like maybe the climate impact won't be existential at the end of the day.
Right.
But like if you can win that there is a lot of defense to the politics argument, and you can win a good risk of the like AF case, or just like solving climate change. Plus like maybe some time on weighing, just like being like the time frame stuff isn't super relevant for whatever reason, and maneuvering around that, I think is probably the closest to winning you're gonna get, which very well might be just depending on the judges and how they kind of like gave their RFDs. I wasn't paying so much attention to the RFDs, but I did like hear the basic like first couple of sentences. And it seemed like they were like defense, no, politics, like sure, risk is there, plus weighing turns case. Which like simplest RFD, sure. But obviously there was a lot more detail added to that. But I think it does need to involve a little bit more judge and ballot direction. I think this is like generally the key to maybe from if you are behind winning these sorts of rounds, which is that like you are going to be giving a speech that people are going to be like raising eyebrows at because they're going to be like, yeah, like this is I don't know how I feel about this. And so you need to like acknowledge that elephant in the room. And so maybe there's an element of that both on the weighing level and on the like actual defensive level. And like to give tangible examples of that, I already give a tangible example of the defense, but like there was this like, like policy paralysis argument that was kind of floating around. It didn't end up being like relevant. Like I don't think anyone really talked about it that much. But maybe there's a way you can make it relevant. You can be like, I know this, you might not think this matters, and like you might be justified in thinking that it doesn't matter. But like here's why it actually does. And like you can get maybe them to resist temptations, or something like that. Like, the fact that their argument isn't conceded means they have I don't know, something about their probability, but just something where you like take the arguments you have, move them around in a very like weird way. It's like, if you're on a chessboard and you're like moving your like knight, I guess, like a little like one extra space to the right, but you're doing that and also telling the judge like, look, this is actually where the knight goes. Or this is why you should let me do like even if it's not actually where it goes, this is why you should let me put it there. And I think that could have enhanced the final, but I thought it was still very good, given everything.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think there are largely like two versions of the final focus that are potentially winning. One is like all in on the defense. Like literally like a minute 50 on defense, 10-second case extension might do it. And the other one is like really try to claw back into the weighing debate. I think there's a reasonable shot if you're like perfect on the flow of doing it. The biggest thing that you have to overcome with that is I think it is true that Plano is behind on probability versus time frame. Um, at least on the flow, it seems that way because there's a conceded argument, or like conceded argument that says that in like first rebuttal, I think that says that probability is subjective because everyone has different opinions of what probability is. So time frame comes first, if there's a short circuit. I think this is like okay, I actually have a question for you about this. This might be a paradigmatic thing, but it does open up bigger questions for me. I think one way of dealing with something like this is saying, yes, you are right. We conceded that sentence, which is that probability is subjective. Everyone has a different idea how probable this is. You have also conceded a sentence from our case that says probability is, not subjective. There are empirics that we can use to compare the most probable scenarios for something. And so the question is not which one of these is conceded. They're both conceded. The question is how do these two different statements interact, and which one is correct? And so if we can prove that our statement was actually a preempt to the statement that you gave, there's no need for us to have cross-applied that preempt in second rebuttal. We're doing it now in second summary. And because it was straight from constructive, that's actually fine for us in the round. And so there's a way to, I don't know, maybe you have something to say about this, but I feel like this is a general strategy that works sometimes.
Yeah, I'd have to like maybe watch back and like know the specific wordings of what exactly was said both in case and in rebuttal, but I think it's a general strategy and maybe even in this round that does work. I do like that though. Like think it's like being very clear about what you actually conceded. Like oftentimes like conceded does not equal like you just like end of the round, right? Like you are conceding an argument. Different arguments have different levels of persuasion levels. Like obviously like they carry a different amount of weight. I think one thing this is, and I'm just gonna go on like a little bit. I'm gonna like diverge like a little bit from what we're talking about. Like an example of this is a lot of people at the end of their case try to like say like must respond in second constructive. And then people usually respond to that. I actually think you don't need to respond to that in second constructive. In rebuttal, you can say, we do not need to respond in second constructive. And if I prove that statement true, then it proves I didn't need to address that argument in second constructive. Like that's an example of like conceded statement, but it doesn't matter because like if I win this statement being true in this moment, it would address why I should. It defends my practice earlier in the debate. So I actually think if you do read must respond in second constructive, you should also include a reason why they need to respond to must respond in second constructive in second constructive. But yeah, like that's like a little bit different, but kind of the same theme. But also like, if you are reading that, do that. But yes, like you are conceding a particular statement. Does that statement matter? I think is another question to maybe ask. Like I think this is also true with like certain arguments. Like I think that like maybe a take that I have that's similar to this is that not every like conceded argument is like necessarily 100% like probability. And I was arguing with one of my debaters about this, but like I think like yes, like they do have high probability, like pretty high. But I think like let's say I conceded the statement that there is a 30% chance of a pandemic in the next 2 years. I conceded a 30% chance, not that it will happen. Now, let's say the debater phrases that as a pandemic could happen in the next 2 years. Does that changing of the phraseology mean that I conceded an argument with 100%? I think no. I think that you conceded a could statement. That could statement established through debating can have relatively high probability. And we should be lenient towards teams who make could statements because obviously debate cases are full of could statements. But there is a level at which you can be like, yes, you conceded a could statement, but that's all it was. Maybe the warrants weren't great, so I don't believe the could becomes a would or whatever it may be. And so like there is maybe ways you can articulate like a particular statement being conceded isn't all that relevant. Like if I just like said absolute gibberish. Like, and then I'd be like, my opponents conceded that. Like, I think a fair response is like, yes, I conceded that. I conceded stuff that just doesn't make sense, like, or is irrelevant. And I think you can do that too. So you can be like, I conceded stuff that doesn't matter. The stuff I conceded is not particularly relevant. And then maybe I think you can tie in some of the stuff you talked about earlier, which is that like this is already taken out by something that we have already said. Like for example, if I make an argument and I like preempt an argument, if I say like, economic growth is bad because it causes like, I don't know, environmental damage, people might say it reduces poverty, but that statement you should be skeptical of and is flawed because X, and then my opponents say economic growth reduces poverty. And then like I extend my argument, I can just be like, look, like this is preempted or something like that. Maybe not the most like directly analogous situation. But I think there is like definitely a truth to what you're saying, which is that like you can take a conceded statement and work with it. Like you can maybe use something you said earlier or just play with that statement itself.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I'm so happy that you are on board with probability weighing being real. It's so puzzling. Like, I think the example you gave is actually perfect. Like, if I find evidence that says this is like a 50% chance of extinction, obviously I should include that. It's so weird that our current model of public forum debate is such that it disincentivizes me from including evidence that gives me a 50% chance of extinction. Because if I don't include that, I can pretend it's 100%. It's like ridiculous. Like, who gave you the right to say this is 100% probability? Like, what crystal ball are you using? And yet everyone just happens to be fine with it for some reason. But yeah, I completely agree. One of the more radical claims that I have about this, though, is that even if we have a model of debate that in which concessions are 100%, like maybe let's pretend they have like implications and like you as a judge are uncomfortable with like a rehashing of the original statements because not only was the warranting conceded, but the implication was conceded. And so that means that like if the warranting is true, which it is, it must be terminal because the implication was there. I think even then, there's an argument to be made that not responding to something in the next speech is not a true concession if you had something in a previous speech that did respond to it, and that speech was not a speech in which an extension was required. This is the same logic behind short circuits, for example, or prereqs. Like, why do you get to make a new implication of your case against their case, which is effectively just defense in a later speech in the round? Like, really, that just seems like, okay, you had something that existed earlier in the round. It's arbitrary if it was a constructive speech or a rebuttal or where it exists on the flow. And you're just saying that now that applies as defense on a different part of the flow, but yet everyone is okay with that. I think that it is the same logic should allow you to hypothetically use preemptive spikes in your case to frontline arguments, even if those applications are not made in second rebuttal. The easiest example is if those applications were literally made preemptively, like you literally in the tag, it says like, if they make this response, this is a response to that. Then like, I feel like most judges would agree that you don't need to apply that again in second rebuttal. Maybe they would prefer if you did, but I don't think that it's necessary. I don't think it's GG if you've conceded something that you preempted and the speech that you conceded in did not require extensions.
Yeah, I think if you make it like an element of your case, maybe that definitely plays a role. I think one thing that this kind of ties into, that I did want to talk a little bit about, is that like in the TOC finals round, there's a way this round could have gone like vastly differently, which is that like Strake also read like a weird third contention.
Yeah.
So this third contention, like we were gonna read the first time we were neg in an elimination round that wasn't like a lay round, although some of the arguments were read, like in the lay round that was had. But like the entire point was just like a bunch of reasons why the AF is just not a, and like to be fair, like in that debate, you can give, I think, a winning neg summary or just going for that argument plus like maybe offense elsewhere. Like there's a lot of warrants there. Some of the cards are better than others, but some of them are actually like quite good if dropped. So like, and a lot of it relies on some surprise factor. Like there's one thing about like an upcoming Supreme Court decision that one article says will determine like the future of the nuclear industry. There's one about like a Trump, which is the one they ended up going for, which because I think it's the one they understood the most. They didn't like defend it at all. They just kind of extended it across a few speeches, but like that's maybe one area where you can debate a little better. But like had you defended the argument, like the responses would have been like quite I think clear. I think just based on like the evidence, how the arguments are articulated, that kind of stuff. But it's interesting to see how a team would navigate that. Or like if you have conceded, for example, the argument that like Trump is sabotaging himself or whatever. Can you then still maneuver out of that? And I think that's an interesting exercise. So I think like if people were to like get anything from this round, it should be like there is like clear value in the debate as it happened. But there's also like a debate that could have happened or a different version of that debate that is particularly interesting. Like if you're going to give a neg speech, maybe try going for one of the arguments. Like read the or like stuff in the third contention and try going for one of those that was like either underdeveloped or like relatively conceded. And then if you're the AF, try to play around with that. Be like, okay, I only have these responses in rebuttal. To be fair, like Anuj did breathe on all of them. And so like you can be like, given what I had, I know it's not a lot, but I have this response, and this response. What can I do with that? And so I think there's definitely stuff that you can do there because a lot of this is kind of similar to what you're talking about, where it's like a lot of that you could argue is preempted by an element of your case or by an element of fiat that you get to defend or something like that. And so there is, I think, interesting exercises there where when it comes to that particular third contention and the particular thing you're talking about.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say on this is taking this to the extreme. This is a viewpoint I actually wholeheartedly agree with. I think if your contention is good enough, and I think warming, for example, is true enough in this round, I think it is hypothetically possible to concede every response against it and still win on that argument. For example, if you give 10 responses against warming in first rebuttal, I think it is hypothetically possible for me to stand up in second rebuttal, say every single one of your 10 responses is true, but none of them are sufficient to disprove our argument. And then literally sit down and still win by final focus against a very good team. This is a paradigmatic thing, but I think if you are like the god of debate, I think this is not just possible, perhaps doable even if you're not the god of debate. Like my argument is this actually, if you're just like smart about this is actually somewhat easy if your case is just good. Like I don't know if you know debaters who are really good at frontlining super quickly with cross applications of case. It just seems like the same thing. Like, yes, I have conceded your argument that Trump might sabotage himself. But you've conceded arguments from my case that are empirics, that every single time in the past we've ever done this, it has succeeded. Yes, you will say Trump is unique, but all that I conceded is that there are reasons why he might restrict the nuclear sector. You haven't given any warrants why he will eliminate the growth of the nuclear sector, and I get fiat power to say there will be an increase in federal investment, which is sufficient. I don't know the exact warrants here, but like I feel like there's ways to wiggle around any of these arguments if your case is good enough.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I'd have to think more about like the response thing. I do think this does lead to like potential. It's interesting though because I think this requires the judge to input a lot of thought into like where exactly something is addressed as like a response in the original case or true enough. But I think there is like that's really interesting, thought-provoking like kind of situation. Like can a person say that like they have like two cards and then they'd be like the claim made here like that is like it technically like it doesn't directly like say like explicitly say like if they make this argument this is the response but like it has like two words that are like potentially could be molded into a response with some additional warrants, maybe. So I think that's interesting as well. But I do think, though, that like generally speaking, preempts in case should be rewarded more because oftentimes they're just treated like another front line, which I think they deserve a little more than I think just being another front line because they were there and constructive, not addressed. But I think a lot of the times they literally just become a front line, and then people can address that front line or whatever. And like honestly, saying it's from case in most rounds doesn't really add much when I think it should.
Yeah, exactly. I think that more than case is not rewarded enough. I think being second is rewarded too much. If I read a card that says yes extinction and you read a card that says no extinction, why the hell do you win if both are dropped? Like, why is reading no extinction not dropping the yes extinction? Like, you are dropping the yes extinction card. If you don't have an indite or a reason your study is better, then we just both have cards that say the opposites of each other. Why is the round so different in front of tech judges if it had been flipped in order? Like literally, I could read the same card I read in constructive against your no extinction card, just in second rebuttal instead. And suddenly every judge says, "Oh wow, well it was in second rebuttal instead of second constructive, so I guess it's a front line instead of like a thing that was responded to by the original response." Like I don't know, it just seems like a really weird arbitrary preference for something that comes afterwards, when really most of the responses read in rebuttal are not responses. They're independent reasons why the opposite of the claim is true, but they still are leaving open and in most cases conceding the reasons why the claim is true. So now we just have reasons why claim is true and reasons why claim isn't true, but none of them have been compared to each other if your rebuttal is the average PF rebuttal, which I think leaves room open hypothetically for that comparison to happen, even if an argument is conceded.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's move on a little bit. Do you have to go at 10 EST or 10 your time?
10 my time, so I have a while.
Okay, let's go. Because the next thing I want to talk about, oh man, I've been thinking about this so much, is K's in public forum. First, I'll let you do your rant because you were mentioning earlier, like maybe first negative is a little bit weird. I'm sure I will agree with a lot of those things. Then I want to add some of my rant, and then we can make this into an organic discussion. But I am excited to talk about this.
Okay, I think a couple of things are interesting. First, I think like maybe for a while in PF, we assumed that there's kind of like a burden of rejoinder. I don't think that necessarily exists in PF because, I actually think calling it con is a little, in my paradigm, I refrain from using aff and net because I think there is a meaningful difference between pro and con. Although sometimes in my RFDs, like I don't know, it just changes. But I try to use pro and con as much as
Have you
possible.
have you been watching my video? Like this is all the stuff I've been saying recently.
I've watched a few. I don't think I've gotten to all of these takes. I've seen a few like parts, clips,
It's
takes that
just
people
like
have me like thoughts on this. But
it's very interesting that we're all arriving at these takes independently at like a
yeah,
weirdly the same time. But yeah, sorry, go ahead. I
yeah. So I think there is some sort of meaningful difference there. But anyways, like putting that aside, because I think it gets explained by maybe some of the other stuff, there isn't exactly maybe a burden of rejoinder, because like I think you are just proving the resolution, like kind of like do the benefits outweigh the harms, or like should an action be done, should an action not be done? So there's that, which is interesting because then like the neg, the theory of a lot of their arguments in policy and LD is that they are rejoining the affirmative specifically, and proving the affirmative specifically is a bad idea. Okay, there's that. There's also, I think, and this is maybe the biggest like problem or like kind of gray area with case, and that's alts. I think alts are just counterplans. Alts are counter. They just are nothing more than counterplans. They compete. They are a solution that you are proposing, other than that competes with the F. If it doesn't compete, it loses to like a version of a perm argument. And if it, and it is a competitive solution, it's just a competitive solution. So like when you view alts as counterplans, and then you'd be like, wait a minute, like how many of these counterplans that we are considering alts are we going to like agree are theoretically legitimate? Like if arguments that like I think far better worded counterplans can lose to competition debates pretty decisively, like alternatives should be doing so as well. But more importantly, I just don't think they are like allowed. So I think like in my paradigm, I say that like I think alts and counterplans are sufficiently adjacent. And I also think that like because you are not allowed in many instances to maybe read a counterplan. Although I have seen some of your generalized like practical solution takes, which I think are interesting. I think maybe, but I mean, maybe you can make the case that like, I don't know. I don't think I don't think you can make the case that something like if the alternative is decolonization, that decolonization is a generalized practical solution. Maybe under some interpretation of the words generalized and practical, it certainly may be a solution, but who knows? Maybe it is generalized. Sure, decolonization is generalized. And if you really think about it, it might be practical because it's good and practical means good. I don't know. But there's ways that you can maybe maneuver around that. But I think that the alt is maybe something that people aren't exploring with. And I think people have kind of realized this. Alts are very carefully worded nowadays. Like a lot of teams that I've judged, and like, for example, the team that I coach that reads Ks, there's actually a few that read Ks, but they try to be very ambiguous with their alts. They try not to commit to fiating anything directly in the K. If they ask if it's fiated, they'll be like, "Oh no, don't worry about that." But then if no one ever says anything about it being fiated, they'll be like LOL, it was fiated. There you go. And then there's also like some of that stuff. So I think it's very interesting how that functions. I think the other thing, right, is that if the neg goes first or the con goes first and they read their K, the AF could just not link. Like they could just do something that's not defending whatever nuclear energy is. And then I think like it's interesting, does the other team reach topicality? If so, that might have some tension with what you were talking about in the first constructive speech. And then of course like you can make the argument that like we're like screwed either way. Like you want us to be topical, but then if we're topical, we're racist. Like what do we do? Like and so there's maybe stuff with that there as well. So I do think there is a lot of potential here. I also think like some of the framework arguments more broadly are interesting because people will make arguments about like what the role of the judge is and what the role of the ballot is. And I think those arguments have some interesting discussions attached to them. Those are my general like kind of feelings and thoughts on Ks and PF. I think there's a place for them. I also think they get more complicated with on-balance topics, which I haven't thought about a whole lot. But just assuming we're using should resolutions, the alt stuff, the general like what is the burden of each team, the like order stuff, all very interesting, and I think create problems. Or at least tension with some of the ways that these arguments are read and adopted from other events.
This is scary, bro. I feel like you're inside my brain. Like I feel like if you took a script of what you just said and I read it and I looked back on it later, I would have thought this was all my original thoughts.
Wild, yeah.
But no, yeah, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. I have a few questions for you though. I have recently come to the conclusion that in terms of K debate, pro and con and PF are entirely symmetrical. I agree with you that there's no burden of rejoinder and there's no burden of proof for the pro. They're not AF and neg, and actually the NSDA rules do say that there's no burdens. Interestingly, like that's like an explicit line in the rules. But this seems to mean that if we're not talking about the topic, or if we're only talking about the topic through a critical lens, then there's no reason why you need to be pro or con to read a K. But there is in certain instances, and the reason this is weird is I think the core complaint that I have is that there's a bundle of like a bunch of completely different things. They're all called K. And it's like we just decided anything that is remotely critical in nature, like we're just going to call that a K and pretend it's the same argument. But I think that actually Ks usually work like a MIRV, like the missile that like splits into pieces, and it actually has like a bunch of tiny things inside of it that are doing completely different things at the end of the round. I guess I have like these notes on this. So I think a K is one. It depends on the K, right? If it's a topical K, then by the end of the round, it could become one defense if you're using like your theory of power to say that their solvency is impossible or something like that. Two, it could be a counterplan with their alt. So the counterplan solves the AF case or the pro, I should say pro case, whatever. Three, it's a DA, right? This is obvious. Like it's just like a weighed, like maybe it's effectively like a DA with framing on it. Four, there's IVIs, a bajillion different reps arguments, like microaggressions are becoming a meta now. And that's totally different. That's obviously not even topical anymore. Like that's just theory offense, basically. Or it's like the same layer as theory offense, like pre-fiat stuff. And then five is these weird discourse voters, which this is like the mainstay of like a KAF equivalent, or I guess most of the first constructive Ks I hear in PF are just like vote for us because we said some good stuff. And if we hadn't, we would have said worse stuff or something like that. But this is like, I mean, at the very least, this is already five different things that seem completely separate from one another, if thematically related, but we're for some reason treating them all the same. So I think that we need to have different models for understanding each and every one of these things. Actually, I'm kind of annoyed that they even have the same name in the first place, because I feel like that kind of misrepresents how different they are. Makes it harder to teach them for sure. But in terms of non-topical Ks, like the IVIs and discourse voters, who cares if you're pro or con? That stuff, I mean, it's the same as reading a theory shell effectively. So why does it And so my question for you is like, I assume the reason that your team did not read the K on the AF is because it was a topical K that required some link to either what the other team is doing or the resolution. And they were not then going for the other pre-fiat stuff like IVIs and the discourse parts.
So yes, at least in its initial construction. I will say though that in a majority of K debates that I see, like a lot of these debates turn on these IVIs and I think in-round presence, again, going circling all the way back to that, super important here. Like the way you engage a K is very important. But like, there is like I think a lot of like, yes, the initial K construction, but then towards the like as the debate progresses, it becomes more like what's the cheapest way or like easiest way to win? Maybe not cheapest, but easiest way to win. And oftentimes that is like the IVI thing. And that's where like the framework stuff comes in. Like the framework arguments that people read in their rebuttal speeches, you should also be exploring, I think, a whole lot because those are kind of where the money is. Like that's where they're explaining, like they're getting all their offense there. They're getting really small pieces of offense from things you did. Like and a lot of that can just be free offense for them. Even so, like a lot of way I like to, a lot of the times I like to think of it like this. Like by the end of most K debates, even if you materially improve conditions for the group talk being talked about in the K, you can still lose. Like
Yes.
via the resolution. And so think about that. Like you obviously want to be in a position where if the resolution is beneficial for X group, you should win. A lot of the times that is just not the case. Like even if like extinction or whatever, preventing it like obviously good or whatever like the reps you read or whatever like that. And so the more I guess that the team responding to it can be like, look, if we materially do X, we should win. That's good. But yes, the reason it was not read as a KF is just because um, like as a K like neg, I guess, or con, like they could be saying a lot of the stuff about like, the AF just being bad for X group. And that's maybe a little bit more persuasive than some of this IVI stuff. I think the IVI stuff kind of builds off of sometimes the initial like theory of power and the way your argument is presented. And you can tie a lot of it into like the same kind of warrants. Like if there's a structure underlying nuclear energy, maybe like X practice that they are doing is embodiment of that structure or is very adjacent to that structure. And people will be like, yeah, I think K rounds actually are really like vibes rounds a lot of the times. And this is where judge input is especially kind of important. And like there is a lot of judge intervention. But yeah. I think there is kind of groups there. I will say that I also think that maybe sometimes, not always, topical Ks are a bit of a misnomer. Because like a lot of the times they're not really Ks. Like they're just like, can you call it disad with framing a
Yeah.
K?
Yeah,
Like
true.
and a lot of times it's what they are. Like think about it like this. Like maybe it's just like like disad counterplan, and that's really it. Like, and then they read like uniqueness. Like that's all that's really going on here. And sometimes, I mean, sometimes people will just read an argument plus framing, and they will not attempt to gain like offense off of anything other than the hypothetical implementation of the resolution. And I think there's definitely elements of extra topicality, which is another interesting consideration, which is that a lot of people will defend the resolution. They will say we are defending an investment in nuclear energy, but then try to win the round off of something that is not tethered to whether investment in nuclear energy is a good idea. Maybe it's the fact, I don't know, that you read the AF or something like that, or that like they did something. Depends on what it is.
Right.
So like people do, I think, sometimes try to gain offense that way, and that's also interesting.
Yeah, this seems like the equivalent of either a discourse voter or if they're really treating it as post-fiat, this is like the AF equivalent of an alt, right? Like they're just
Hmm.
fiating um like an extra topical plank in their,
Sure. Yeah.
method or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, it's interesting. I did write a K for the TOC. Never was used, but it was on the con. And we read it in a practice round going first. I did this with my APTA partner, my former APTA partner, who was a K debater in policy in high school. And so he helped me write it. But the logic that we were using is that maybe in PF, actually, it does make sense for the neg to read a K going first because there's no plan. There's nothing that the AF is proposing. There's nothing the AF is advocating for other than the resolution itself. And so if you think about it, the equivalent in policy could be the 1AC is just the plan text, but the plan text happens to be the resolution. And then the 1NC can still get a K link off of the plan text, even if there's nothing else that the app is doing. The weird thing is that in policy, the reason that I think the 1NC like only makes sense reading a K after the 1AC is gone is because they're critiquing what the content of the affirmative was proposing, right? And so like the evidence, for example, that is read, the arguments that are read by the 1AC are all used as textual evidence in going about interpreting what the plan is supposed to be, and like what the status of the plan is. And that is how you garner links for Ks from the 1NC in policy. And so it feels like in PF, you should be able to do at least a version of that, even though you go first, because there's nothing different that the app can propose. Like the app can't in the next speech sever out of that and say like, oh, well, actually, we have a different plan. Like, no, you don't. This is PF. At least is how we were interpreting it. The problem is that this still relies on an assumption of neg as having a burden of rejoinder against the plan, which is maybe more accurate to PF, but still not probably perfectly accurate to PF.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do think that there is stuff there that like yes, like I mean, there should be like there are some limits to what maybe the pro or the AF can do. And if that limit is a defense of like nuclear energy, then absolutely, I think you can make, and then you can make the arguments about research or whatever, and like whatever they said in the following speech and rebuttal or whatever. And there can be stuff there. I do think though that like it's so there was actually a debate at the King round robin, where things almost went like kind of badly. So like Strake read the K neg first.
I
It
saw
was
that.
sec call. Yeah, yeah, and then Fairmont read like ontology. And then like they were like again, this is like they were like, okay, guys, like what are we gonna do now? They were thinking about it, but then Fairmont read a couple of reasons at the bottom why investment in nuclear energy was good, and then that was literally like that was the debate. That were like they were like, all right, screw that. Like, yeah, you defended nuclear energy, boom, that's the link. Like, who cares if it's actually good? But like whatever. Like, and that became that. But like a lot of the maybe the arguments you're making, like for example, if you're reading an alternative, I think if you're reading an alternative, if that is legitimate, then the app certainly gets, I think, a plan. Because if
Right.
the app, yeah, yeah.
That
But
makes
I also don't think that the alternatives are theoretically legitimate. So like, what are you then doing if you're not reading an alternative and it is only limited to offense based off of what the resolution can generate? Then I think it is just disad framing. That's it. That's all it is. So I think you can read a version of a K that is disad framing neg first and be totally fine. But then again, I think it is just more complicated disad framing, or that combination. So I think if you're gonna, and maybe you can do some of the stuff that you would do in rebuttal with a K the same way.
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
can maybe still do that, but I think you are limited more in your one NC kind of construction. If you were going to go that route and you want them to be topical, like for example, you don't want a persuasive push for them to be the like, look, like you want us to do the racist thing and now you're complaining about us not doing the racist thing, or like or them being like you're doing all this other stuff that I think like you read an alt and you want us to be topical, like that kind of gray area that you don't necessarily want to confront. And it's weird, right? Because usually topicality is read against Ks. So like if you want to avoid some of that tension, I think disad framing is a good way to go about it. And I think there's also an argument that you can make about how like I think the pro of the resolution, their burden is not necessarily to like avoid controversy, but to defend the assumptions that we have said are underlying their practices. So I think maybe a way you can phrase this is just that like, look, there are things that are inevitable about what we talk when we talk about nuclear energy. Our model of debate just asks you to confront it. Like we think it's bad. You can say it's good. You can say it's not a problem. You can say those assumptions should be cast aside. But it is still your burden, or maybe not burden, but it's still your responsibility as the pro of the resolution to confront those assumptions. And maybe you can make a framework argument about that. But there is interesting, I think, limits in 1NC construction or con construction if it is then trying to limit or is going to just be like con first as AK.
Hear
Or
me.
I
I'm cooking here. I have a lot of things to say that just came to me.
okay.
Number one, yeah, when we wrote this K, we actually we anticipated that the second constructive would be entirely non-topical, and then so we wrote a T-shell for the K. Like the T-shell says, when you responded, like the pro has to defend the topic, and if you don't, then you don't win because the judge should only vote on if the topic is good or bad. And we answer that question, you don't, GG. I think that the complaint that you foresee is that the second team might say, okay, well, you just told us that this topic is the racist, so we don't want to defend like a racist thing. I think that this is a little bit silly though because it is a DA. I think this is equivalent to saying like, if I stand up and read like nuclear energy causes waste on indigenous land, and you're like, oh, you're right. I don't want to defend that. My bad, guys. I'm gonna just say something else. Like what? This is you're just abdicating your responsibility to do this debate. Like you knew this debate was about nuclear energy going in, and you still came and you still knew that you would be on both sides of the resolution. We're not making like an ontological claim that is like inherently true for every single round outside of debate. We're doing debate. We're testing whether or not nuclear energy is good. And right now, our rules say it's bad, and your rules say it's good. This is the reason that we think it's bad. You should be able to defend against that. That's the whole point of this debate. Um, Number two, the conclusion of that is I think that actually, in fact, the topical K is able to leverage topicality. Um, the second thing that I'll say is you're completely right. This alt nonsense is weird. If you read a topical K as first constructive and you read an alt that is fiated, certainly the second constructive should be able to read a plan that just like coheres with your theory of power or like just obviously like escapes the link to the K in some way. So this seems dead in the water, not to mention the fact that this is just also illegal in public forum. So I think there's a different way to think about alts though. This is something that I've been toying with recently. There's like alts that are like a lens. Like this is a philosophical way to understand this. Maybe they're even closer to like a framework argument, really, than an alt. The argument would just be like the resolution is bad if it fails this philosophical test, and our alternative is just explaining the criteria of the test, kind of like an interpretation. Like when you're doing a theory debate, you don't fiat the interpretation. You're just saying that if they failed the interpretation, this makes their practices abusive. It's just like a baseline against which we measure the fairness of their practices. And it's proof. It's more of a preempt against the argument they might make that the practices are inevitable or that they're the best. They're like the least bad of all evils. And so in that sense, you don't have to fiat this kind of alt. You can just say that the alt is a theoretical test of the ethicality of the resolution, or the assumptions that are necessarily undergirding the resolution. And then you escape some of the cheating allegations, and you also don't let them have a plan. Um, the final thing, this is when my mind really expanded, is that public forum is about the most probable implementations of a policy resolution, right? I don't know why K's changed this. So perhaps the link to the K can be that the most probable way that this policy will be done is in a way that will have these assumptions that we should critique. Even if your assumptions, I don't care what your assumptions are, fellow debaters, you can be as cool as you want and as free from settler colonialism as you want, but US government isn't. And so, yes, our argument is a little bit nihilistic, I guess, because we would be advocating that all resolutions that have anything to do with the state doing something that might affect indigenous people are probably bad. But we'll stick by that. Like we would be happy saying that the con is probably good on almost all of these topics. This is still just a DA, but we use the alt as a theoretical test of the ethicality of the topic. And importantly, you can't get out with anything about reps or you can't imagine a way that nuclear energy can be done well, or you can't get out of this by saying that this isn't inherent to nuclear energy. We are fine accepting it's not inherent, but it is incidental to the most likely way that nuclear energy will be done. It's just a DA.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot to that. I think that like there are a lot of like K tricks like kind of in the bag of K teams. This is one of them, which is that like, the AF and I think maybe you don't necessarily maybe like strategically for strategic reasons you might not make this like immediately apparent. But you might say like later in the debate, like they might say like this the resolution is good, nuclear energy does this, this, and this, and then be like, but you drop this card that says the state operates in a way that invariably will be bad, or invariably puts its interests first. And then you can supplement that with some sort of explanation for why the most probable of the resolution is just like, a version of genocide, I guess. If it is like, if that is relevant to the K. And so there's definitely, I think, a lot you can do with that. Like you just make like a most probable implementation is bad argument based on, and I think actually like 90% of Ks can do this with the cards they already have. Like it might not be the most fantastic, most probable implementation argument, but it is certainly there. Like their cards are definitely saying things along the lines of like, no matter what, like the theoretical benefits of a thing may be, it's misused. And I think that that's like a common theme, I guess. So you can definitely make this argument no matter what it's not that hard to find, I don't think. And it's not that hard, I think, to incorporate. And it is easy to miss. I think, because you're not intuitively thinking about like how does this affect the implementation of the topic. But maybe like, pro teams or AF teams should think about that a little more because there is like obvious like kind of stuff you can do there. And at the alt as like an ethicality kind of question thing, I think is also interesting. I think a lot of alts are like kind of interesting in that way, in which they like try to make it so that like they're not necessarily doing anything, but they are like just trying to operate within the jurisdiction of the resolution. And then a lot of this like kind of blends into like you were talking about it as like an interpretation, like the way teams read framework offenses, right? Like literally saying like our interpretation of what debate should look like is this. And that's very similar, I think, in many ways to like kind of the alt parts, the alt, your vision of the alt, which I think is kind of consistent maybe with like operating within the confines of the resolution. And I think like the way you like kind of talk about how like the AF or pro should be topical is absolutely right. Like I do think that like obviously like like there should be a level of debate to be had. You can't just like get out of it by saying like oh well like you trapped me. So I think there is a lot of maybe truth there as well. Um, Maybe something else to consider is that like I actually like think that you can read topicality on the pro or the con. Um,
Yeah, 100%.
so, so like people in the AF, they read the AF as framework. They read framework, which is a little bit different. They say weigh the AF against the consequences or whatever, like whatever it may be. Weigh the AF against something. Competitive alternative, status quo. Weigh the AF. Competitive alternative is bad. Why are you giving them a competitive alternative to say weigh the AF versus the status quo? Whatever. Weigh the AF versus the status quo. I actually think topicality can be read on both sides because again, like there is no like difference really. Like both the pro and the con should have the obligation to like now what it means to be topical and what the implications of topicality are also interesting questions. But like, yeah, I actually think you can read the same shell on both sides. There's an aversion to doing so. I think there is a justified aversion to doing so, because judges will not necessarily know how to react. And I think this is like real. Like if you read there have been debates where like, for example, a team has read topicality on the pro and like a judge from like policy or LD land is like, what are you doing? Like, you can't do that.
Bro, it's
And
so
so
sad.
like,
That's
yeah,
like the
yeah.
worst.
Yeah. So I do think there is some justified like kind of aversion there, but I think that like maybe over time it'll approach the idea where like actually like the pro and the con have like the same obligation in the round. And I think it doesn't necessarily change. Maybe you can make arguments about why like the way around flips can maybe implicate what their obligations are, but I don't like that. I like the more like there is a set obligation for the pro and the con, and that doesn't change based on like how the order of the debate happens to be. There is just like, you know, uh,
Right. And I feel like the fact that the con can go first proves that. Is that the con should
yeah.
be expected to do the same thing regardless if they go first or second. And their role is very clearly outlined like in the NSDA rules. I guess like okay, the rant is that I think that a lot of the things that are coming in from policy and LD are great, but they're not tailored to PF at all. Like they're just copy pasted and they don't work that way. Like we don't have the same burdens. We don't have the same internal logic of how debate works. And so, and I think it's a big shame that like a lot of policy and LD debaters and coaches and judges are coming in and sort of like, I think it is sort of setting back PF's unique innovation as an activity. And then, of course, they complain that it's just a worse version of policies. Of course it is, right? Because we're just copying from policy. And then every time you try not to, then the policy judge says, oh, but that's not how policy works. But maybe it's how PF works. I think the solution to this is just if a critical mass of people realize that this is happening and they just think a little bit more about how things work in PF in particular, instead of how they work in LD and policy and how to copy them over. Problem with all of this is a lot of it inherently relies on an understanding of public forum debate that is assumed, that stems only from historical norms and the NSDA rules. What do you think about the NSDA rules as a source from which we can draw like a coherent theory of public forum?
Uh, so I think it's vague. Maybe intentionally so, I'm not sure. But I do think they're good and that they should be looked at more. Now, of course, not every tournament uses the NSDA rules. Like all Texas-based tournaments, for example, defer to the TFA rules, which I can tell you like a crazy story about like an evidence thing that happened at a TFA rules tournament. But anyways, like I'll get to that maybe in a second. But like I do think the NSDA rules are something that people should utilize more. I think that like there is like a good amount in there that's really interesting. I also think that like beyond like the nature of public forum, there's also evidence stuff that I think is really interesting, like evidence challenges and the way those occur. I think are definitely vary, but like I think like a lot of other events have kind of said like we're just not going to use this as a norm or as an enforcement tool because their events have developed so much. PF hasn't had that same sort of development, and I guess we're kind of deferring to the NSCA rules as an authority or kind of guide. Like tournaments like the TOC, I guess. I honestly think like tournaments should just use the NSDA rules because I think they're the most comprehensive document. That doesn't necessarily mean they are comprehensive. I just think they're the most comprehensive. Um, and like the TFA rules and the TOC rules, like they're really not like that good. Like they're just like general, like kind of like we hear some practices that we think are they're useful. I mean, I think there are a lot more questions than answers in all of these rules documents. But it is the least true of the NSDA rulebook. And I also think like it also is probably the most true and makes the most sense to what the event was kind of supposed to be. So I think there's a lot of value there. I think with the description of public forum and the limits placed there, but also with evidence challenges, which I'm happy to talk about as well.
Yeah, I've just have been having trouble with it because I'm realizing I'm foreseeing a dark future where people say, you're not allowed to have a counter plan. The other team says, oh, but this tournament isn't following NSDA rules. Here are 10 theoretical reasons why I am allowed to have a counter plan. But it gets like worse because there are lots of arguments in which the marginal utility of calling them out for violating NSDA rules falls, even though those arguments are clear violations of how the internal logic of public forum operates. I'm foreseeing a future in which there's this weird patchwork that starts collapsing all of our understanding of PF as a unique event into just theory, like just who can make the most arguments about if they want to follow PF or if they want to be LD in that particular round. Um, and I'm a little bit worried about that because I feel like a lot of my intuitions about everything stem from a foundation of logic of public forum. And if you question the foundation, I think it might be difficult to have a conversation in general in public forum. Um, because there's so much that hinges on that about like what is the pro, what is the con, and what do they have to do.
Yeah. There definitely is. And I think that like actually maybe um like to talk about something you mentioned earlier, which is that like, like a debate where like someone says like a tournament doesn't use NSDA rules, haha, like that kind of situation. I actually think the best way to make an NSDA rules argument at a tournament that you should still make, and I think you should still make the argument about NSDA rules at tournaments that do not use NSDA rules. And I think you should implicate the argument as like one, like we are not just saying that like jurisdiction, sure, but like we're not saying jurisdictional. Like we can be wrong about jurisdiction and still right. But this is the best way the public forum should be. And maybe it's predictability because a lot of tournaments and most tournaments use NSDA rules, and it's better for an event to have a stasis point kind of. And then, but also like more than that, like there is an obvious purpose to public forum. We think that purpose like makes sense, and that's why we are deferring to the rules. But yeah, there is, I think, a lot of different, and I think like some tournaments, for example, mandate that the pro goes first and that the con goes second. And that's interesting. That's weird. Like you can do that in some situations. And like, some of them will call them I always like pay attention to this, like which tournaments. It usually is just dependent on who is in tab room. Like in Texas, usually Bryce is in tab room. And every time he's in tab room, it says AFNAG. Like at Blake, it'll say AFNAG. At like tournaments that like I don't know, like some of the ISD people will be in tab room, like it'll say pro con usually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like it's interesting, right? But like there is a lot there where there is like maybe like different, almost different events being debated at different tournaments.
Yeah, it's really weird. Even the NSDA, I learned recently, is inconsistent about this. Like the NSDA rules say pro and con, but if you look at a sample NSDA ballot, it will say AF and neg. Or actually, there's like a
Yeah.
sample NSDA constructive speech, and it starts with I affirm. It's like what, like, what's happening here? But I do think like it seems like a really tiny difference, but it actually I think a lot revolves around it that is very difficult to argue about within a debate round. Um, for example, like I think one of the most important things is the stasis point you mentioned. I think it's so important for us to agree upon some baseline assumptions about how the debate works before we go into it. Like what does the pro do? What does the con do? What's the topic? What are the speech times, etc. If we can't agree on those things, like I legitimately don't think it's productive to have theory discussions about those in the round because they're so foundational to the conversations we're having in the first place. I don't think it's like it seems like every single debate would break if the meta is just go for like I get plans. Like as long as the opponent is not talking about plans and counter plans, then you just say like here are three theoretical reasons why actually plans and counter plans are legitimate, and then you run a counter plan or a plan. Then you just beat them off of that every time if they lose the theory debate. But like I think the problem is it's hard to justify why this stasis point is the best. The problem is that it's not perfect. It's not the best stasis point. Its value stems from the fact that it is a stasis point rather than the fact that it is the best stasis point. But it's a difficult argument to make in a debate round when you're saying that, like, our argument is that this is the most predictable. And the opponent says, well, who cares if it's the most predictable? Like, it shouldn't be the most predictable. If you vote for me, then the norm that I'm proposing spreads, and then that becomes the most predictable. Kind of the same logic as disclosure theory in the early days. And so it's a really tough sell to say like the true argument is that the fact of it being the current stasis point is what makes it valuable. But that's a difficult argument to make in the debate round. And so as a result, the meta could quickly become just a proliferation of completely different extreme alternative stasis points or different models of how debate should look that have nothing to do with the original vision of public forum that change like the structure of each round completely each time. Maybe I'm like exaggerating the problem with this happening, but I see it as a pretty big threat to the event.
Yeah, yeah. I think there is definitely some trouble there. I do think I have some faith in like our ability to maybe iron out those differences. And in some debates, obviously, they don't necessarily become an issue, but I do think it definitely has the potential to become one. I think you're right on the money about like why it's valuable though. Which is that the fact that it just is exists. It's just like I was having like a conversation with someone. He was like, "Why do we like drive on like the right side of the road?" And I was like, "I don't know, just because we
Yeah.
do." And like probably good that like we shouldn't like change that, I guess. Like but like it exists as a thing, not necessarily because it is good, but because it is needed in some capacity, and that's the decision that was made, and that's what should exist. And like, that has some value, I think, to it. It's hard to articulate what that value maybe is, but I think there is value there, and I think there's also danger there as well, because like it's easy for people to say like just admitting something is a stasis does lock us into like forms of rules and interpretations of the events that might not be like ideal. And so like, like the way like, maybe courts work where they overturn a decision, like those things are good. Like obviously some decisions should be overturned. Some precedents should change. I think this is one that maybe shouldn't. Maybe I'll be convinced it should. I'll like stay open-minded about it. But like I do think that like it gets hard to articulate that, especially because of the danger that carries with like the danger that comes along with it, which is that like if your general claim is just that having a stasis point in all situations is good, and that it should always be that way because otherwise it's unpredictable, then you do run into a lot of issues with like how do you make an event better in some capacity? Like, is there a possibility for reform and change? But that is difficult, especially because like I don't think the NSDA will change the structure or elements of public forum like anytime soon. Although they might like release supplemental information again, maybe contradicting some of the stuff that's already in there, but that is I think very interesting to consider. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that maybe the biggest problem is like, unlike a court, the precedents don't have as much of a binding power when it's like round by round, and
Yeah.
they're much more informally determined. I do think that there's a logical argument that should be made in rounds where this does happen, in these hypothetical rounds where people are like, counterplan's good. That's just like a transition costs argument. Like both in the analogy of driving on the right and the analogy of overturning court precedent. I think that one thing we need to consider is that there's a very high bar that needs to be crossed. Like there's a very, very high cost of that transition. Like if the US government said, actually, we think it's better for everyone to drive on the left, we would like the cost would be enormous, right? Certainly, probably, even if there's evidence that comes out that says driving on the left is objectively better, than driving on the right. I don't think we should make that change um, unless the evidence is so persuasive that the benefits will outweigh the transition harm. But the transition harm is the biggest thing that you need to be comparing there. So I think that's an argument that should be made in these theory rounds. And this is maybe like a very extreme version of reasonability, but I think it's justified in its extremeness.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Okay. Um, Theory best practices maybe is the logical next place
Okay.
to go. Now that we've been talking so much about rules and theory and how to go about determining it. So what is your take about theory best practices and maybe about how this relates to some other things we haven't talked about yet, like evidence quality in public forum?
Yeah. Okay. So I do have thoughts here. I'll share, I think, one trick when responding to theory that people don't take advantage of enough. And this is something that I always tell people when I'm like talking to them about theory, which is that like, so there's obviously two kinds of counter interpretations. There's one that's defensive. That's one, like, let's say like, I think I'll use the example of Comic Sans. The interpretation might be, and let's assume it's worded well and like there aren't obvious interp flaws, but it's like debaters must send their evidence in Comic Sans. You can respond to that in maybe two ways. You could say a defensive argument saying, I can send it in whatever I want. But of course, your opponents then don't get intuitively there is no offense off of that unless you like win an RBI. Because like all you're saying is that like they met the interpretation too. Like you're just saying that this is a better model and we both meet it.
Wait,
Um,
I predict what you're going to say. I think you're in my
yeah.
brain again.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think
Go
the way
for
you
it.
respond is by saying you must do what we did, and you didn't. Is that right?
Close. Close. I
Okay.
think I think I think that falls under the umbrella of what I'm saying. The second would obviously just because it must not use Comic Sans, but that's
Right.
extreme. Like
Right.
maybe the benefits of Comic Sans do outweigh the harms. I think the best way to word it, and this can apply to like any interpretation, is teams must not force other teams to abide by insert practice.
Right.
And then that way you get both angles. You can be like Comic Sans is bad, and you can be like we should have the choice. And both of them then become offense because not now it's not like you had the choice and you chose to do something and your opponents had the choice, but that they forced you to not have the choice. So, like for example, if someone says paraphrase, like, and you want to defend the choice of paraphrasing, you can be like, you must not force us to paraphrase. So, like, there's an element of incorporating the fact that they read theory in the first place, beyond just the general practice, that I think makes any defensive counterinter you can word it offensively, and you should because there you go, that's offense. And like the risk of offense sort of stuff flips. So I think like now some people might take issue with like the word force because maybe they're not forcing you to do it, but some version of that becomes like they must not ask you to abide by or something, that insert practice, and you get every argument under the sun that you can think of as a response to the theory shell, and all of that becomes offense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I had it a little bit wrong. My take for the longest time has been that like most of the counterinterps in PF, unlike LD and policy, because of the symmetry of PF, can very easily be just worded into offensive counterinterps, like teams must paraphrase. This is not usually done in LD and policy, except for some circumstances, because the af and the neg are totally different. Like all of the theory shells are about like what you're allowed to do in the 2AC. And this is like obviously not something that applies back to the neg, because it doesn't make sense. Like even if like the most extreme you could do is like actually we have to do this in the 2AC. And then they're like, okay. But that doesn't say anything about what they have to do. And so the symmetry of PF allows almost every counter interpretation to become offensive. I think the difference with what you're doing is you're doing something even smarter because it allows for more generic arguments, like a wider umbrella of arguments to be included as standards for the counterinterp while still making it offensive and making sure that the burden you have to prove to win the counterinterp is not as high. Like if you word it extremely, like you must paraphrase, probably, in terms of what we were talking about earlier, like just the perception of the judges would probably be averse to voting on something like that. But if you word it as like, oh, must allow the choice to paraphrase, then it's like, oh yeah, I like people having the choice to do things. And you get these bonus standards. They're like about epistemic dogmatism that I think are actually quite persuasive. Like, I don't know why people aren't doing this. I think there's so many good arguments. They're just like, you have your model of education that you like. I have my model of education that I like. I'm not hurting you. It's fine. Who are you to say that your model of education is better? You have some arguments that are objective, but are they objective or are they subjective? I think if you boil it down, a lot of these are just subjective. Like there are reasons that appear objective why one model of education is better than another. But most of those just boil down to preferences. Like are there really objective reasons you can give why like depth of research is better than breadth? Like, I like knowing more things, but knowing shallow things about them more. Like, I should be allowed to do that if I think that's more educational, even if I don't have an objective warrant why it is.
Yeah. I think that ties into like another piece of advice that I have for theory, like slash observation. I'll do like a shorter one first though, because I think that like that's a longer discussion. The second one, I guess, before that one, is just that I think asking solves a lot of the time. And I think like the common response to asking is that it's not a norm. I think you should just say like we are establishing the norm that you should ask. And then you solve a lot of offense. Now, I think the other benefit, right, is that a lot of the times when you are asking, you are giving them a chance to think about whether their practice is good. And that makes theory debates better. Like if you can surprise gotcha someone on an idea, then like maybe that doesn't lead to the best debate. Like obviously someone that has been thinking about why they can articulate why a practice is good will maybe beat someone that is just now being confronted about that practice. And so there's obviously I think better clash there maybe, but also I think like it gives them the ability and option to change their mind and be like, okay, sure. And then if they don't, you read theory. So I think in a lot of situations where like, the abuse isn't like tremendously obvious or it's like clearly deceptive, intentional, or it becomes something where like it leads to in-round abuse to a meaningful extent, asking does solve a lot of the time. And I don't think people use the argument as effectively as they should. I think they can make it a norming argument. Like the norm should be that if you want me to like do something weird with my font, for example, that like you should ask like via email or something. And I think that so asking does solve. So if you have any thoughts about that, but
No, I 100% agree. I've been telling people this since like people started reading disclosure theory in front of me. I think it's useful to draw a distinction between types of theory arguments that are common in PF. I think there's broadly two, and they overlap, so it's a bit funky. But one is like foul calling. By that I mean like you have cheated. You did something that was unfair. I'm not no longer able to fairly win this debate, so we got to stop and do something about it. Whereas the other one is like more norm setting, right? Like how can we collectively get closer to the ideal perfect version of debate? And so if we have something that's slightly more close to the ideal than you, we should win. I think the first one is much more legitimate than the second one, and the second one should be much more easy to beat than the first one. In a round where they are calling a foul, um, you should just say it wasn't a foul or it wasn't, like it wasn't unfair. We didn't really skew the round very
play
much.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, play on exactly. Like, sorry. Or and this is a strategy no one uses, but like there are other ways to penalize us other than the ballot, that like are more suitable to the violation that actually occurred in the round. For example, like, okay, drop all of our evidence. I don't care. We're still in the round. Why are you dropping us? Like, okay. The second one is like cut a speaker point, cut half a speaker point. Like whatever you think as the judge is suitable as recompense for this violation. If it's an issue with like the actual fairness of the rest of the round, maybe like we will sacrifice 30 seconds of our next speech. We'll have a 3 minute, 30-second rebuttal. That'll make up for the fairness violation. But we don't have to lose. I think those things, like low key, they're logical. Like I don't know how you beat that. Because you have to somehow toe the line of like explaining why this abuse is enough to specifically justify the ballot. And the way that people will do this is by running over to the other type of theory. They'll say, "Oh, no. This isn't just foul calling. This is norm setting. We're not just saying that you killed our ability to win this round because it made it so unfair. We're saying we want everyone to stop paraphrasing. And this is about the norm of paraphrasing. So the ballot becomes a signal to the rest of the community. And so then it shifts over to this other kind of theory. And then you hit him with like, why didn't you just ask? Or like a lot of other arguments about reasonability that I think are very good. Like it doesn't make any sense for a team to always lose if they don't have the perfect practice. Good is good enough. If I highlight in blue, oh, I didn't highlight in green. Sorry. One, ask me. Two, it's good enough. Like I'll just resend the evidence 10 seconds later. It's not that big of a deal. Chill. And I think that literally is just a game over argument for like most of these norm setting theory shells. So either
Yeah.
way, you've got a way to win.
Yeah, I think I largely agree with that. I do think, though, that there is maybe a distinction we should draw. I think good is good enough is mostly true. I do think though that there is like an element of like where like you should allow people to still challenge whether good is good enough. An
Mhm.
example of this is I think disclosure norms. I remember when I started debate, like it would be crazy if you open sourced. And anyone who said you are open source would say you are doing too much. Like, what do you do? Like, if you uploaded like your entire site's page, like that was amazing. And like this is like going back like maybe before ninth grade, like when I was in middle school and I was like looking at the wiki. Like a few teams like maybe did it, but then like we constantly, I think the current state of disclosure, like if you believe disclosure is good, the current state of disclosure is that's a big if, right? If you believe disclosure is good, I think the current state of disclosure is quite like people open source their evidence. I think even rebuttal evidence, which is an interesting topic in and of itself. But like a lot of the times the gut reaction is just to be like, what are we doing, guys? Like, come on, good is good enough. So I think there is a line to draw there, which is that you still should allow people to push bounds, but you should maybe hold them to a different standard. Or you should allow, there is an element of like sometimes if you rely too much on intuition, like I think judges are generally biased towards the practices that were good when they were a debater. And I
Yeah.
don't think people should take that perspective. If you're justifying good is good enough as being like reasons that you thought as a debater yourself were good enough. I don't think that's good. I think if you are coming to that conclusion based on an understanding of like what's exactly going on here, giving the argument some charitable leeway, right? And to truly thinking about whether or not something is a good idea, then I think that is a good standard. But I think a lot of people do get lost in this trap of being like, no, like come on, like back in my day kind of stuff. Which even if it isn't directly, you're not directly doing it, you're kind of indirectly doing it. So I think that there is like definitely some interesting stuff there. Like there definitely should be the benefit you should not be able to win on theory just because you prove a benefit. And I think like part of this is that like a lot of people talk in abstract terms when they talk about fairness and education. They'll say kills fairness, kills education. Like no, you're not killing fairness, you're not killing education. You might be slightly adjusting it on the margins. Like education might improve, but like let's assume that you win fairness is more important than education. Even if fairness is more important in education, does a 1% loss in fairness then in like outweigh like I don't know like 100 degrees of education? Assuming 100 degrees of education is quite significant. Like probably not. And so people need to talk, I think, less in the abstract on theory. And I think part of that is one, examine like what the opportunity cost of reading theory is. Like obviously there was a benefit to having the debate over like whatever the topic was or whatever the debate that would have happened. Or there is a benefit to, for example, foregoing that theory debate or that attempt to set a norm, I guess, in favor of just doing what we already do. And like obviously there are transition costs, as you mentioned earlier. Those are all like opportunity costs that maybe should be taken into account. The second is that like don't just look at fairness and education in the abstract. Like those are relevant, sure, but just simply saying fairness and education outweigh or fairness outweighs. Like a lot of people say like they make the fairness paradox argument. Like if you don't evaluate fairness, like, throw your flow out, vote for us, or like how can you expect fair evaluation of the round? So like and in abstract terms, maybe, like, but practically no. Like
Yeah.
again, like the debate can still be had and you can come to a reasonable evaluation of the round. Like, I don't know if your speech doc font was a little different. And maybe now I'm not saying dogmatically people should automatically be like, no, like hear the other team out, sure. But like your gut's probably telling you something for a reason. Just explore that reason instead of just solely relying it on as like a gut feeling. If you are a judge. And then I think if you're a debater, like fairness and education don't exist in abstract senses. They do, but like in the context of the debate, I think they're more effective when you just be like, there are margins to fairness and education. There are margins to inclusivity.
Yeah.
Explore those margins and weigh them. Yeah.
You're in my brain again. I'm literally about to release a video on fairness paradox, but it's the same conclusion, is that literally like the margins solve, right? Like the paradox only seems like a paradox because we have this binary thinking where like we either care about fairness the most or we don't. Um, doesn't make any sense. Like our argument is that yes, you should unfairly evaluate our arguments if doing so would create a massive increase in education sufficient to offset that decrease in fairness. We think both fairness and education are valuable, and we think that it's reasonable to assume that in this particular case that we're arguing about, the change in education is greater than the change in fairness. And so fairness paradox is kind of just an observation that fairness matters. We're not saying fairness is like bad, but we've also observed that education matters. So it's not really an argument at all. It's not a weighing argument. Like it's literally just like again, just like fairness exists. Okay. But that doesn't like pre-structure all of your thinking about the entire round. I don't know. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think like this is part of what makes theory strategic, I guess, is that people aren't necessarily thinking about those like interesting caveats or distinctions or nuances. And so there are a lot of, I think, good theory arguments that win that aren't necessarily like maybe the truest, but they're really difficult to respond to because there is some obvious benefit, or like it's really hard to contest the benefit to them. Now, of course, you can weigh that, but like just getting someone to think about like what are we doing instead of that? Like, okay, yes, what are we sacrificing by doing this benefit? It's hard for them to maybe, wrap their head around instead of just being like, oh, this is good, this is bad. That's way simpler for people to think about. And so maybe that's why some of the theory arguments that are prevalent now have some strategic value.
And this, I think, this stems from a problem in thinking about substance debate, in my opinion. It's compounded by the fact that people abstract further away from substance when they go to the theory flow. But it's a problem in substance as well, which is that I think people don't adequately address the real comparative in the round when they're comparing arguments. Like they sort of, everyone's thinking in these logical binaries that are kind of fictional. Like extinction is the only thing that matters. If I get there first, I win. That's end of the debate. Or like the question is nuclear war versus climate change. And our argument is if you must care about nuclear war because if you don't, then you'd be dead. So you have to. Like all of these arguments kind of are nonsense when you actually realize the context behind the arguments that we're weighing in their entireties. And that it's not just all or nothing. It's not just a 100% guarantee everyone dies tomorrow or nothing happens at all. Like there is so much in between. And in fact, everything is in between. And that complexity is what allows weighing debates to happen in the first place. So with that, I don't know how much time you have left, but I would love to talk about substance.
Let's do it.
Okay. I've grouped your first three hot takes, which I'll let you describe. Um, and I've written down here two words, sufficiency theory, that I think will be interesting that ties into all of them. But I want you to tell me about your takes, maybe briefly, about extensions, weighing, and non-uniques in extinction debates.
Okay. So we'll start with the extensions take. I think that we have kind of maybe a weird obsession with extensions. Like, I don't think you necessarily need to reinvent the wheel and re-explain every detail of your argument. It feels weird. I do think that, like, if you do care about extensions, people should literally, like, almost be rereading their argument. Like, why are you drawing the line at particular parts? I think people draw the line at particular parts because those parts become less relevant as the debate progresses, and that's how extensions should be judged. If the part of your argument that you are extending is relevant to a point of clash, obviously extend it. Like, if the debate is does nuclear war cause extinction, like famine, nuclear war, not good enough, maybe. Like now, if the debate is just whether or not there's a link to nuclear war, like nuclear war causing extinction is a conceded claim, like sure, extend two words, make it there. Now, I do think there needs to be words extended. Of course, you can't. Otherwise, people can just be like, "Oh, I extended this argument, and you don't know about it." So there do needs to be like a few words. But I do think that like we are a little obsessed with extensions, and I think like it feels like a weird way to decide rounds unless it materially impacts the flow. If it materially impacts your ability to understand how two warrants interact in a competing claim, yeah, extensions matter. If it impacts your ability to understand an argument, it matters. Like I don't think judges should vote for arguments they don't understand. And sometimes extensions help clarify things. And if your purpose is clarification, your purpose is to resolve clash, that part of the extension is valuable. Otherwise, no. Okay. So you want to like do it like one by one, or do I go like all of them?
We can do it one by one briefly.
Okay.
I'll say I agree with you on extensions. I think they're necessary, but we care too much about them. I always like the first time I lost a round on like impact was extended 5 seconds over time. I was like, what the hell is that? And I kind of stand by that initial reaction. Like that seems like a little bit strange. Um, I was a bit of an extension extremist in my first year out as a judge. I would like drop teams for just not extending a warrant. In retrospect, that seems so arbitrary and so unfair. Like so unbelievably out of the control of the debaters because every judge has a different threshold for what they evaluate as a sufficient extension. But more on sufficiency later.
Okay. I'm interested too now. Okay. The second was that non-uniques and extinction debates are kind of irrelevant. I think that this is mostly if you're the next. So I'll explain what I mean. So like if you're making a non-unique that says that your argument will happen in the future, or like your concern is non-unique, like the disadvantage to the resolution is non-unique because something adjacent to it that will trigger the impact will happen in the future. I don't think that argument matters in extinction debates because like let's assume you made the non-unique that the sun will explode inevitably. Like why does that not non-unique the argument? Like, is it because it's not germane to it? Okay, sure. Maybe it's not germane to the link, but where do you draw the line? I think in debates where we are obsessed with, for example, time frame, like how quickly you can stop something from happening. If the neg just wins that their link triggers their impact, it should not matter that it would have happened in like a month because we're operating under the assumption that it's going to happen anyway. If it happens sooner and prevents the AF from solving, that is still good enough. Like the AF cannot solve, like who cares if it's non-unique is my point. Like if something will happen in the future, but it is sped up, and that speeding up of it still prevents the app from doing anything. Like obviously, living less time would be the only unique benefit, and that's good. But the entire point and the utility that neg teams use for like extinction and for their big impacts is to say it short circuits the app, or that there is no app if we are all dead. And if that is the case, if that is the argument, and we all agree that extinction arguments matter and that extinction would theoretically stop the app from doing whatever they're talking about in a reasonable time frame, then it should not matter that an argument would happen regardless. Because I think the way people evaluate debates or should evaluate debates is resolution versus the status quo. Does what is the world of the resolution and what is the world of the status quo? In the world of the status quo, we might all die in 5 months. In the world of the resolution, we all die in 3 months. Okay. Again, the difference doesn't seem that large. But if the implication to us all dying in 3 months is that the app has no benefit, then the only unique harm would then be that difference in time frame. And so I do think that that creates a problem. I do think there are ways to make non-uniques matter. And that's to be like reasons why their argument is less probable. If you are saying, for example, that a version of their link has already happened in the past and hasn't triggered their impact, or something they are talking about, like, let's say it's the oil prices argument after Trump's tariffs, you were like, oil prices tanked and we haven't seen anything, right? You can maybe make that an argument of why their argument is less probable. And I think that is a good way to make it. But if your argument is simply that this concern should not be looked at simply because this concern will occur regardless, I don't think that's persuasive in extinction debates because the fact that it will occur regardless does not matter because the question, of course, is if the concern happens, nothing else matters. So if you win that meta level claim, I don't think that non-uniques are relevant. So I think you could basically concede them and be like, doesn't matter. Like if we win, extinction happens, short circuits the AF, should not matter that in a world without the resolution, we would have otherwise died because that is also just a version of non-uniquing the app. Like assuming the short circuit's true, the non-unique causes the impact, the app just gets short-circuited anyway. If those statements operate in like uh, it operate together. Like if my argument is like X policy will cause economic decline, nuclear war in 5 months, and the argument I have made is that economic decline in 5 months turns the AF means they can't solve, then like the AF just cannot solve. Think of it like defense to the AF. That's all it is. Like you're just saying the AF cannot solve their impacts because the policy that a president or someone will enact in 3 months will make it so that you cannot solve. And so then because of the short circuit slash extinction becomes terminal defense, and the only difference would be we just live less because we all die quicker. And so I think that that's my like weird take on non-uniques
Okay,
against the neg
this
and
makes sense. So, to summarize what you're saying, um, it's the equivalent to non-uniquing a short circuit. If I say this consequence of the AF will stop the benefits of the AF, and you say that will happen anyway, I say great, then the AF is going to be stopped anyway. And extinction
yeah,
is one such short circuit, which means this applies in extinction debates, right?
yes, yeah.
I disagree. Um,
Okay.
I think the disagreement is not so substantial as it might seem. Um, I think this relies on an assumption that the internal link has a 100% chance of extinction, which is an impossible assumption, and I think quite a false assumption in almost all rounds. I think if it is exposed that this is an assumption, which is a big if, right? Like if everyone takes this for granted, then you're completely right, which is maybe most cases. But if it is exposed in the round that your extinction scenario, if your link happens, this does not guarantee extinction. And I say there is a 100% chance your link will happen anyway, then this is terminal, I think. Because then the thing that you're saying might have a 5% chance of short-circuiting the AF will happen anyway. There's no difference between the two worlds in terms of that 5% chance of short-circuiting the AF. So there's only risk of offense on the AF. I think that this is true of every round because there's no round in which the internal link to extinction has a 100% probability, definitionally. And so I think the AF can always win a risk of offense against this if they have a somewhat terminal non-unique, and this is the neg's only argument, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually agree with you. I think that like the thing that I'm trying to stress here, and maybe this is the broader point, is that this like thing we have with extinction being 100% probable, like we're in a lot of debates, so many debates, extinction is 100% probable at the end of the day. For so many judges, for so many debaters, and this is a logical problem with
Yeah.
maybe that being a thing. And so like I actually agree with you that like it should not be that way. But I
Yeah.
think in a lot of cases it is, and then
Yeah.
therefore
Yeah.
triggers, yeah.
It's weird. You're right. Like assuming that extinction is a 100% probability has all these weird downstream implications that debaters are not reckoning with. That I mean should be exploited maybe, but also I think are additional pieces of evidence that this is not the correct way of looking at it. And perhaps
Yeah.
not the most strategic way of looking at it in lots of if you're on the receiving end of these exploitations. If you're AF, for example, if you're the one non-uniquing the negs extinction scenario and then allowing them to have a terminal short circuit on your case, it seems like it's pretty bad. Although, I mean, what happens then? Does neg just win on presumption? If we all agree extinction inevitable in 3 days.
Oh, okay. I think the way you get around that is just by saying that like we trigger the link quicker. So like yeah, it's gonna
Oh,
happen in
right.
5 months. Happens now. We live less. Um.
But if the non-unique is terminal enough in terms of time frame as well, then
Oh yeah.
it's just
Yeah,
presumption.
I do think yeah. There
Okay.
is like I guess just like presumption. It's weird. It's weird because I think there is like maybe a version of that that could play out. But again, like operates under this big assumption. I do think that like people should, if anything, it should help people like maybe realize that this is a weird assumption that we're making that like all these extinction arguments just are 100
Yeah.
like just 100%.
I think this is the worst assumption that is made in technical debate, bar none, is that anything is 100% probable or 0% probable. 0% is a little bit more acceptable because things like it is a useful heuristic to assume that something has a 0% probability in some cases. Certainly probabilities approach zero. Like even the most wild case, like the most wild case we could test is like you are reading an argument and my response is that the country your scenario is about doesn't exist. It's like it was made up by this author in their book. Even that is technically not terminal because of like the fact we have to doubt everything and like there might be a chance that this author of the book is right and the country does exist and they didn't even know it. They are inventing like scenarios with their writing. I don't know. But for the sake of debate, terminal defense can be said to exist, even though it's not technically true. I think on the other end, though, assuming something is a 100% guarantee because of something made an argument made in the debate is meaningful. Like it that tangibly breaks a lot of important things that should happen. Like the weighing debate, I think is often broken by that. So assumptions of 100% and 0%, I think tangibly shift the debate out of the realm of logical argumentation in ways that are unstrategic in some cases. That's my
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Just for like pacing thing, I probably have like 25 or so more minutes.
okay.
So I can talk about some of the other takes. I think the other one is kind of stemming from this, but it's also something that I kind of want to talk about, which is like probability time frame and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think probability weighing is real. I think we've established that. I do think that a lot of debates nowadays are just like who can cause extinction fastest, who can stop extinction. If the neg wins their argument, plus that it happens relatively quick, the debate is usually over in many instances. I do think that people should maybe push back on this more. One, I think there's obvious assumptions that time frame makes that like, shit does not happen like immediately. Like it doesn't. Like obviously stuff takes time, but let's assume it does happen quickly. An argument that I like made in high school, like a couple times was about like dinosaurs. And so like it was just like we know that the dinosaurs died like 65 million years ago. We don't really care about like what like the other digits were. And
Yeah.
that's because like extinction is such a big event on a galactic scale, that like it is the erasure of history, future, all everything considered. And when you are evaluating that, the differences of even a 0.1, 0.2% increase in difference in probability far trumps, like mathematically, far trumps even a century of time frame. And so just because of how vast like things are. And so I think that there's arguments you can make there about probability that I think should be explored. I do think though that like the time frame debate, like it obviously has some intuitive appeal. And I think it is especially hard to confront when someone phrases it as a short circuit because they're just saying like we can't solve your thing if our thing happens. And I think that's the most persuasive way to articulate time frame. Not necessarily that your argument happens faster and therefore it's like better, but that like if your thing happens, it stops the ability of the app to happen. And this might sound circular though, but I do think probability is in many cases a prior question. And people will say like, but like why? And it's because you'll say, well, because if it doesn't happen, then it doesn't matter. And it might sound circular, but I do think that like obviously there is like the meta question of like, will this stuff happen? And if the answer to that is maybe not, then I do think differences in probability do matter and do relevantly impact. For example, if we are looking at it from an outsider evaluating human existence, and you are making a mathematical decision about what is best for humanity, like the differences of 10 years versus the differences of like 10%, easy decision, the 10% probability. And so I think there is something to be explored there. I think debaters should think about that more. It's hard to articulate, and obviously I do think that you do need to confront this argument that like short circuits, but I do think that can be maybe addressed by like the fact that again begs the question of will it will it happen? So time frame good, yes. Strategic argument. Aft teams should, especially, I think this is a reason why I think climate change is underutilized as an impact. Like it's a great impact. There are so many ramps to extinction. There are so many ramps to Turn's case. Its biggest downside is just that it takes a long time. But maybe the fact that it takes a long time is because there are just so many things that could go wrong with climate change. It could implicate so many different areas. Like even if it's not existential in and of itself, if anything in debate is existential, it might be climate. I don't think nuclear war, by the way, is existential like at all. It would take like a crazy nuclear war, I think, to end humanity. So I think that's kind of the true part of Spark, which is that nuclear war probably wouldn't end human civilization. It would be bad, sure, and it would probably short circuit in some way, which again, like these debate arguments kind of relate. But like, if you can argue anything, maybe climate change leads to nuclear war. Maybe it leads to like the same sort of effects, but whatever it may be. But there is interesting things to consider when you zoom out of debate just as who can get to extinction the quickest.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I'll make this very quick. I think time frame doesn't matter to expected value almost at all. It technically could be an internal link to magnitude using duration or an internal link to probability using intervening factors, but it usually isn't used that way. Probability definitely trumps the short circuit. An analogy that will help this is you can imagine if I press a button, there's a 1% chance if I press this button, it'll give me a headache and it will remove the button. But there's a 10% chance that if I press the button, it will save 10 people and I get like 3 more buttons after that I can continue to press. Obviously, like this is a short circuit. Like maybe the saving 10 people happens later. And also it depends on the chance that like the non-removal of the button, that it doesn't trigger that option, right? So it clearly is a short circuit. I guess it comes first on time frame. But the time frame doesn't seem to matter at all. Like the short circuit is the only reason the time frame matters. If something is a short circuit, it doesn't like that is allowed by having an equal or faster time frame, or being in some way mutually exclusive with the other side. And so this seems to obtain in this case, but obviously I'll press the button. Like there's so many more reasons in terms of expected value to press the button. The short circuit only works if it's a 100% chance, which we've revealed is not ever true. And so if it's not a 100% chance, it is only a probability argument. The short circuit is only an internal link to probability. It decreases the probability that the benefits will happen. And that's just how you add it to the calculation of probability times magnitude. And I think treating it in any other way is just incorrect logically.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
yeah. I agree with you. I do think that like maybe you can make like you would have to maybe change the way you look at it. It's not expected value of humanity. You're looking at debate in a slightly different way. Maybe you can make a case that this isn't the best way to look at things. But I think that requires proactive argumentation. Like obviously, if I were a judge in a given room, I'd probably care more about 10 years than like individually. I'd care more about 10 years than like a 1% decrease in probability.
oh
But like I don't know. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
But so there's maybe angles there. I also think like relatedly, like try or die is an interesting concept. I think it has like ethos appeal. And it's like I think people should make the argument because it is persuasive and it also blends like in non-uniques, right? You're making an argument about like the neg impact being non-unique, which is
right.
good. And like obviously like if the internal link is not 100%, which is an assumption we described earlier, it can be relevant. I think people are maybe sometimes one thing I don't like about try or die is that people are either like pretty dogmatic about it. They either believe it's a very real thing and that if someone wins try or die, they win, or that try or die is just fake. I think that there is somewhere in the middle where we can meet, and that debaters should be able to debate, for example, whether try or die matters, and you can adjust your threshold for explanation of it. But I do think that like the current trend is I either see like people like it's either like you make the try or die argument and they like it, or you don't make it and they don't like it, or you make it and they don't like it rather. And so like we should be in the middle more and just be willing to let people debate it out because I do think it's not so logically terrible as an argument as maybe people make it out to be, and it does contain I think some like ethosy appeal to it. So yeah, there's that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the logic makes sense. I actually think it falls for the same trap as the short circuit, which is that the internal link is still not 100%. So you can't guarantee 100% chance of extinction from a given scenario in SQO either, which means, I would prefer a lower chance of extinction over a higher chance of extinction. And so even if there's a very high chance of extinction right now, if the neg can prove that it goes up instead of down, that should matter more to me than whatever it is right now. Um, and that is always possible because it's not 100% right now. So that same critique applies. Though I do think it's somewhat persuasive if it's made correctly. The last thing I want to talk about while I still have you here is sufficiency theory. I think this applies most to our discussion about extensions, but I think it applies to everything pretty deeply. It's a kind of an existential crisis I've been having about debate. On the one hand, there's all the stuff with NSDA rules. What does the pro do? What does the con do? What is debate at all? But then there's this other thing about like, is debate even real? Like, is technical debate even possible? The problem that I have identified is that there's no such thing as a sufficient warrant in an extension or in the argument as it's originally presented. Uh, how do you know when you've done enough work, given enough reasons, provided enough evidence for your claim to have been proven true? Um, and I don't like the way around this that people are using, which is just saying, oh, well, if it's conceded, it's true. That seems wrong. If it's conceded, it gets as much truth as it originally had, but I don't know that that makes it more true than it originally was. So I'm interested in hearing your take about this. Part of the problem is like there's no real difference between a warrant and a claim. All warrants are also claims that hypothetically should need their own warrants. And there's an arbitrariness problem of when you stop that seems entirely determined by norms.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think like I do get kind of the existential elements of this, which is like, you're taught like maybe to ask why a whole bunch, and you can keep asking why for like forever. So I do think this is kind of a thing, and I also like do think about claim warrant impact a lot. Like you useful like heuristic maybe, but like obviously like all you really need is warrant, and maybe just warrant, because everything else kind of falls under that, but at
Everything
least warrant
is
and impact.
everything. Like
Uh,
warrant
yeah.
is claim is impact.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I do think though that this leads to interesting. Like, I don't think anyone can be 100% technical as a judge, and trying to be is impossible because if you are 100% technical, like rendering a decision would be impossible. Like I think, especially in the confines of a debate round. So there are sacrifices we need to make. Now it's interesting, right? When do you let like some of the dogmatism bleed in? Like obviously we do believe certain things and hold on to certain inclinations. But when do we like stop and when do we say that like this is enough of a warrant for me to convince me otherwise in the context of a given round? And so there is, I think, a varying standard for all of this kind of stuff. And no judge will be exactly the same. Um, and so I think you can kind of maybe in a general area, like apply and probably hit like a bunch of judges like threshold for what constitutes a warrant, like what is sufficient as you're talking about. So I do think all judges have varying degrees of sufficiency. I think like one of the benefits of like having an activity, right, is just that people come to similar conclusions about what sufficiency looks like, but it'll be different for everyone for the end till the end of time. But I do think that yeah, there is like a point where you have to like let go of your desire to maybe uncover the truth, or to like perfectly technically evaluate around and just be like, or even approach a debate and just be like, look, there are some places where like I have to let some of this stuff that I know is not really that technical kind of seep in, but it's necessary to make all the other technical stuff kind of valuable, and important and fun. So yeah, definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that there are two implications from this. One is like as a competitor, you should this should be a little bit scary, but mostly comforting. If you lose a round, it's not always because like you made a horrible mistake. I guess like the comforting part is more you shouldn't try to 100% control the decision every time or like that should be acknowledged as a futile goal. And I know that people already say this, but they say it because of biases. It's not because of biases. It's because of the inherent structure of the activity. Even the most perfect judges will always have varying understanding of a core component of what gives you offense or not. And I think acknowledging this maybe reduces like I don't know, like you can be a little bit more free from the wins and losses if you're like it's all just a game in maximizing the probability that a given judge votes for you. But it's technically impossible to be objectively correct. Um, you're just playing a game within the norms. Second implication is that I think for judges, uh, it's actually maybe useful, at least in terms of sufficiency, to give yourself up to the norms of other judges a little bit in the name of creating an activity that is predictable and like a game that's workable. Like the most important thing in creating a fair competition and a workable game is if there's like a generally agreed upon standard for what counts in the debate. And I think that unfortunately, it seems like the only possible way to create that standard is if judges sort of follow each other, generally. Like if there's like a space of norms that loosely defines what is acceptable and unacceptable. And you shouldn't fight that space of norms so much because it's necessary to create the activity.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really interesting to consider too. But yeah, it is kind of like the perfect solution to this is impossible. Which again, like leads to, I guess, the existential maybe nature of this. I do think one thing it kind of ties into is, and maybe this is what you were trying to get at with like the third like maybe take I had, which is about structural violence. Which is that a lot of the times I do think that like we're making a lot of assumptions and warrants that maybe just like replace like feel goodness replaces a lot of the warrants. Like I think a common argument I hear is, well, people will say like some version of this argument, reading Extinction is a form of structural violence, which begs the question of like, okay, but what if extinction matters more? Like, and I think one form of this argument um, is that like people will say that like for example, if you talk about future generations, you're engaging in like pro-life logic, um, but they'll stop there. That's it. They'll stop there. Um, and they'll go a little bit farther and say that justifies violence. And like sure, maybe. I would disagree with the idea of future generations justifying all those things, but let's assume that even if that is the case, again, like people will evaluate that as a complete argument. I think that's circular because again, if extinction matters more, that is the chief concern. So I think a lot of debate is that on some like, and maybe we don't do this for every argument. Obviously, if it's less maybe like something that we believe or are inclined to believe, then like we are more dismissive of circular arguments in that nature. But like there are so many forms of this just present in every style of debate and every type of round where we accept things as self-evidently true or important when in reality, like proving something else, even if it doesn't feel right, like logically makes it, go away or matter or changes the way things matters in a given debate round. And I think judges also have different standards for evaluating and gut checking that, just depending on what the argument, like a claim about racism, for example. People are going to obviously going to be more sympathetic to that, and maybe they should. Like obviously, like to technically evaluate, are you technically evaluating a claim about racism? Like, is there an element of you just inserting your opinion in the debate? Like a lot of people in their paradigm will say, I won't vote for someone who is like at insert ist, which like good, you should be someone who stops people from engaging in bad activities. But like at what level do you draw the line? Like I think this is most apparent in like some of these K debates where like the claims of someone being racist or a bad person are just kind of flung around. And then you really have to ask yourself, like, do I think so? Like, is there a level at which I'm willing to intervene? But is me not doing so or not thinking so, is that part of the problem? And so there is definitely elements of like ambiguity there when it comes to some of the more sensitive subjects as well. And I think debate like should be a place where we can explore those sensitive subjects. I think debate like obviously one of the best I think skills it teaches you is that like um, you can cut through dogmatism, that you can change people's, you can read an argument like climate change, you can defend that climate change, you can defend nuclear war is good, you can defend climate change is good, you can defend democracy is bad. which might honestly be one of the truer impact turns in like abstract. But like, who knows? You can defend all sorts of claims, but sometimes we draw lines at what claims we accept. And and I'll admit to doing that. Like, for example, I probably wouldn't vote for a death good argument. Maybe I would. I don't know. It was really persuasive, but I probably wouldn't. And that's not the most technical thing to do, but I'm arbitrarily drawing a line there. And that might not be the best thing, but people do that all the time implicitly. And I think that definitely ties into some of the sufficiency parts of it, which is like at a certain point, like we suspend the rules that we apply to every other argument for certain types of arguments or when they're articulated a certain way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like this ties all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation about just your round presence. Like all of this, it doesn't just like accidentally get influenced through biases. It inherently depends on the ethos and the pathos and the framing of this point. This changes the technical evaluation of the arguments, and it should, like it has to. It inherently, this is an inherent feature of debate, not like a glitch, not a flaw of debate. And I think that recognizing that and getting past it will allow you to develop these skills in a way that will help you much more, and that will also allow you to accept some of these things in debate for what they are in a way that I think will allow you to orient your relationship with debate into more productive means instead of just chasing this impossible ideal of objective wins, um, and like making more interesting arguments and productive arguments and innovative arguments instead that can pull on the communication that you have with the judges.
Yeah. I think I'll add this as like kind of like maybe an example of when I thought this was feeling good. I think the favorite argument I've ever cut was on the Taiwan topic. It was an argument about TikTok. And so it was read in Glenbrook's finals. Again, it was a similar situation, which is like read it the first time we have a chance to, but the first time ended up being finals. But the argument was about like a TikTok ban happening, or Trump stopping a TikTok ban. But like the idea of reducing military support to Taiwan would be incredibly unpopular among American people. It would make the president look weak, and historically, presidents have responded by overcorrecting. People on the other side of the aisle would air out like kind of like their problems with China, and there's a form of issue uptake and all those sorts of things. And then like that might result in TikTok not. I mean, like regardless of the truth of whether or not a TikTok ban is good or bad, I don't use TikTok, but I think like some of the fun value of that argument was that like there are elements to where you can manipulate and play with some of the assumptions. Like, what do we treat as a serious argument? I think this is a serious argument largely because I think the link is true. That, like, if we were to do something so dramatic as to reduce military support to Taiwan, people would react very negatively. And people would talk about China more. We would perhaps see forms of overcorrection. And maybe like presidents would act more aggressively and in ways that are more brash and emotional and not productive, which carries obvious, like, turns case implications to a case that's talking primarily about escalation. And so I do think that like if you are making these types of arguments, they are not inconsistent with you being persuasive. Like you should articulate an argument like you are trying to dispel any of the common concerns. Like your angle should not be that like if they lodge this response, like I don't know what to do, like screw the argument. It should seriously be like I understand that this might be an unconventional assumption or warrant that I'm making, but I'm gonna make it and articulate it, and I think I can beat the other team when they say this. And if the answer to that, like if you can answer those questions in a form where I can be like, yes, then that inherently makes your argument persuasive. It's not necessarily that your argument is true. It's that it's well explained. And sometimes truer arguments have a lower threshold for being well explained. And maybe there's something there. But I do think even less true arguments, although I don't think there's like some form of objective truth, maybe, you can still argue them persuasively, assuming you explain them well and rely on common truths that people believe. Like this argument, for example, relied on some truths. People believe free speech matters. People believe, for example, and there is history of presidents and politicians acting negatively. There are elements of truth to every argument. If you exploit those elements and mold them into something, you can definitely create some of these more interesting and unique arguments that might not strike you as true or immediately persuasive, but you can certainly articulate them as such.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that's a very good way of putting it. We need to pull out the truth of all of these arguments as much as possible. And you mentioned something just now that I think is a very good point as well, which is I think the most powerful arguments are the ones that can afford to agree with the other side's criticisms as much as possible. Either the criticisms of their case, I guess that looks like weighing, or the criticisms of their defense, which just looks like protecting your argument, insulating it. If you can say yes to all of those things and still win, This decreases the possibilities for the judge to vote against you logically as much as possible. And I guess we've sort of just set out a technical reason why this is necessarily advantageous, which is that given that there's always a possibility of a judge finding any argument sufficient enough to vote on it, even in a technical paradigm, it is most useful to remove any ambiguity by creating agreement in the round, which minimizes the amount of premises the judge has to find sufficient. Um,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and that allows for a space of much more strategy and much more innovation.
I agree. I think the last thing I kind of want to add to maybe this entire discussion is that, and I think you've been hitting this theme maybe indirectly. I think the most powerful argument in any given debate round is a version of an even if argument. And I
Yeah.
don't necessarily mean like even if as weighing. Like think about like I think debaters are good at maybe finding evidence that reasonably supports the claim, the individual claim they are making. But there is always a broader claim. The most broad claim being that the resolution is a good idea. We are constantly making individual subclaims to support a broader claim at each individual level, you can say even if. You can accept the truth of what they are saying and say no. Like an example that I was just using the other day was just like, let's say Coke is better than Pepsi. 64% of people agree Coke is better than Pepsi. In debate, sure, fine evidence. The conclusion of that, if conceded, might be that Coke is better than Pepsi. But what if you have a study that says that drinking Coke gives you cancer, drinking Pepsi does not? Then who cares about the 64% thing? You can always generate even if scenarios within individual pieces of evidence. Like you can accept the truth of a claim. You can accept the fact that something is true. You don't need to contest. It's hard to contest information, especially if it's factual sometimes. But you can always make a claim about why, even if that information is true, it does not prove the broader point. And if you think it proves the broader point, think about the broader point than that broader point, and just keep branching out. I think the even if argument is so powerful. People maybe only think about it in the context of weighing, but it applies to all the responses you can make. And I think this is true of like just generally how logic works in general and how like people come to different opinions in the world. We all, I think, agree on a lot more than we disagree. Like a lot, it's very rare that people disagree on something that is fundamental. Like for example, it could be that life is valuable. People will agree that and come to vastly different conclusions about different policy outcomes. People might agree that having some form of healthcare is important. But again, there are degrees to which we disagree. But if you can pin down the agreement and say, like, even if, then that I think leads to the best forms of arguments. They're the hardest to respond to because you can't just be like, our evidence says this, because your argument is usually, and even if your evidence says this argument, there's a whole lot there. But I do think that's the best way to, if not maybe respond, because sometimes you maybe just have a really good card, sure. But it's the best way to think about arguments, I think.
Yeah.
Always consider the even if, yeah.
And it insulates you completely from the concessions that have been losing so many people rounds as well. If you
Sure.
believe some of the stuff we were saying earlier about like how you can manipulate those. If you just
Hmm.
like start every rebuttal with just like even if all of their responses are true, they're insufficient, it's a much easier way to insulate yourself from making some mistakes than trying to line by line every single one. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, thank you so much for being on this call, Ishan. You've taught us a lot, and I think we've had a very rich discussion. Any last wisdom to drop for our viewers?
Um, I think most of it would be recapping stuff I've already said. But I will say that, like, cut cards, evidence is important, and we're placing an increasing emphasis on it in this activity. But, like, think about debate. Like, I think that's the most important thing. Just think about debate. Like, I think that is what makes you better. It is what makes it interesting. It's what keeps it fresh and alive. Challenge assumptions. Like, maybe debate your friend or your partner on whether paraphrasing is good. I mean, I think it's bad, but there are reasonable arguments on both sides, and reasonable minds can disagree. Debate your partner on whether disclosure is good. Have those discussions. So I would say keep thinking about debate. It keeps it interesting. It constantly makes the activity better, and it avoids, I think, which the biggest problem, which is dogmatism. So put the evidence aside, sure, do drills, do redos, but think about debate, and you will enjoy it, and I think get far more from it, both competitively and just as an activity.
Well said. Thank you so much for being on.
Of course, yeah.